It was a little after 4 o'clock on a damp afternoon at the end of March 1894 when Edith Marlowe arrived at Bramblewick Station. The rain that had accompanied her through much of Yorkshire had almost passed, leaving only a fine moisture suspended above the fields and a slow dripping from the bare branches beside the lane. When the hired trap stopped near the wooden gate below the platform, the driver climbed down, placed Edith's 2 cases upon a patch of firm ground, and secured the lid of the smaller travelling trunk before returning to his seat. Edith thanked him, drew her ivory scarf more closely around her neck, and waited while the horse turned carefully in the narrow road, its hooves pressing dark, shallow marks into the softened earth. For a little while, the wheels remained audible beyond the hedge, moving steadily towards the village through the pale afternoon mist. Then the sound diminished until it was no longer possible to separate it from the distant movement of water in the ditches, and the countryside settled once more into the quiet that had surrounded the station since the final passenger service ended the previous autumn. Edith stood beside her luggage and looked towards the building above her. The station waited at the end of a short gravel path, its yellow-grey walls darkened by the weather and its long iron canopy shining faintly wherever the rain had touched it. The path was not steep, but the journey had left a heaviness in her shoulders, and she lifted only the smaller case before beginning the climb. Loose stones shifted beneath her brown boots, while the hem of her smoky blue travelling dress occasionally brushed the wet grass growing along the verge. Beyond a bare hawthorn hedge, a sheep gave a low, unhurried call, and another answered from somewhere farther up the slope. Nothing in the landscape seemed aware that Edith had returned after so many years. The water continued to gather at the tips of the branches, the sheep moved gradually across the fields, and a thin stream passed beneath the stone bridge with the same soft sound it must have made on the mornings when the first train still came through Bramblewick. By the time she reached the platform, Edith's glove had grown damp around the handle of the case. She placed it beneath the canopy and remained there for a moment, allowing her breathing to become even again. Before her stood the 3 familiar doors, each with its old enamel sign fixed above the lintel: tickets, waiting room, and station master. The paint around the frames had faded, though the windows were whole and the roof remained sound. Beneath the waiting room window, dead stems leaned across a narrow flower bed where the winter leaves had gathered. The station was quieter than Edith remembered, but it did not appear neglected. Samuel had continued to care for it after the railway company closed the line to passengers 6 months earlier, and the order he had maintained could still be seen in the swept edge of the platform, the straight bench beneath the canopy, and the lamps left hanging securely from their iron brackets. The building seemed to be resting after a long season of useful work, waiting without impatience beneath the damp March sky. Edith returned to the gate for the remaining case. On the second journey, she stopped beneath the large station sign, where beads of rain covered the faded railway green board. Removing one glove, she wiped the damp surface with the side of her hand until the cream letters appeared clearly: Bramblewick. Her fingers remained against the wood for a moment, not because the name was unfamiliar, but because she remembered having to lift her chin much higher to read it when she was 10 years old. On that first visit, she had travelled with her mother in a warm third-class carriage that smelled of wool, coal smoke, and the oranges another passenger carried in a paper bag. Samuel had been waiting beneath the platform clock in his dark station master's coat, holding his silver pocket watch in one hand while he searched the carriage windows for his sister and young niece. During the summers that followed, Bramblewick had become a place of small, dependable occupations. Edith had carried folded messages between the office and the signal box, filled the coal scuttle with pieces that were too small to be useful, and watched Samuel polish the lamp glass at the kitchen table. On dry evenings, after the last train had passed, he sometimes allowed her to help him with the narrow flower beds beside the platform. She had pressed seeds into the soil with one finger, while Samuel worked steadily ahead of her, never correcting the crookedness of her row unless she asked him to. After her mother's death, the summer visits had gradually ended. Edith's work had taken her first to Leeds and then to a smaller town farther south, while Samuel had remained at Bramblewick, where each day continued to be divided by timetables, bells, and the opening and closing of doors. Neither of them wrote long letters, yet twice each year, at Christmas and again near the beginning of summer, an envelope arrived bearing Samuel's narrow handwriting. His pages usually contained news of the weather, changes to the railway, and the flowers growing beneath the ticket office window. Edith answered with quiet accounts of her lodgings, her work, and the streets she crossed each morning. The letters had been brief, but they had arrived regularly enough to become part of the year. 3 weeks after Samuel's death, Edith had returned as his nearest surviving relative. The station master's rooms and most of their furniture belonged to the railway company, but Samuel's clothes, books, papers, and other private possessions had been left to her. She had been given permission to remain at Bramblewick for 6 weeks while she prepared an inventory and decided which things should be kept, sold, or given away. Those decisions could wait until morning. For now, there were 2 cases to carry, a door to unlock, and a cold kitchen in which a fire would need to be made before the light disappeared. Edith put on her glove again and brought the second case to the platform. As she placed it beside the first, she looked up at the round clock beneath the canopy. Dust had softened the whiteness of its enamel face, and its black hands rested at 17 minutes past 4, the hour at which the final passenger train had left Bramblewick on the 4th of October, 1893. Samuel had stopped winding it after that last departure, though he had continued opening the rooms, checking the roof, and keeping damp away from the walls during the months that followed. The true hour was now only a few minutes beyond the one shown by the motionless hands. Edith took the large iron key from her handbag and crossed to the station master's door. The lock resisted at first, as though the wet weather had tightened the old wood around it, but when she pressed the door gently with one shoulder and turned the key again, the mechanism released with a solid, familiar click. A narrow passage opened before her, carrying the enclosed scents of soot, old timber, and cool stone. Edith left the door open while she brought in her luggage, allowing the grey afternoon light to follow her across the floor. An umbrella stand remained beside the wall, and above it hung a shallow wooden dish in which Samuel had kept loose buttons, pencil stubs, and the occasional ticket collected from the platform. Edith set her gloves in the dish, placed her cases neatly beneath the stairs, and continued towards the kitchen. Her first action was to draw back the curtain. The light revealed a black iron range, a scrubbed pine table, and an oak dresser filled with white plates edged in blue. A copper pan hung above the dry sink, and the fire tongs had been placed across the coal scuttle as carefully as though Samuel might return to use them at any moment. His station master's coat still hung upon the peg nearest the door. The navy cloth had faded around the shoulders, and the brass buttons no longer held the brightness Edith remembered from childhood. Beneath the coat stood a pair of polished black boots, their toes aligned with the edge of the wall. Edith removed her ivory scarf and hung it on the empty peg beside them, then smoothed the wool once with the palm of her hand. The two garments rested side by side in the quiet kitchen, one dark from many years of use and the other still carrying the cool dampness of Edith's journey. A cup and saucer stood on the table. The tea at the bottom had dried into a thin brown mark, and the teaspoon lay beside it upon a folded cloth. Edith carried the cup to the sink, filled the kettle from the covered water jug, and poured a little into a basin. When the water had warmed upon the range, she washed the cup slowly, dried it with the cloth, and returned it to the dresser among the others with blue edges. It was a simple task, requiring no choice beyond where the cup belonged, and she found some comfort in completing it. Beside the dresser hung a railway calendar, still open at October 1893. Several dates bore small notes in Samuel's handwriting, though the fading daylight allowed Edith to distinguish only a few words concerning rain, an early frost, and soil beneath one of the windows. She did not take down the calendar. There would be time to read it when the morning light reached the kitchen, just as there would be time to open the cupboards, examine the papers, and begin the orderly columns of her inventory. For the present, she knelt before the range and opened the wooden box beside the hearth. Samuel had cut the kindling into short, even lengths and stacked it according to size. Edith arranged several pieces beneath the grate, struck a match, and sheltered the small flame between her hands until it took hold. A little smoke rose and disappeared into the chimney, followed by the gentle crackle of drying wood. When she added 2 pieces of coal, an orange glow began to spread across the dark iron and warm the front of her skirt. While the kettle heated, Edith carried her smaller case upstairs. Samuel's bedroom looked over the railway and contained only an iron bed, a wardrobe, a washstand, and a plain wooden chair upon which he had folded his working clothes. His spectacles rested on the bedside table beside his silver pocket watch. Edith picked up the watch, pressed the catch, and watched the polished cover open against her thumb. The hands had stopped at an ordinary hour, one that held no meaning she could recognize, and after briefly remembering the way Samuel used to compare its time with the clock outside, she closed the case and returned it to the table. The room opposite had been prepared for her. Fresh linen covered the smaller bed. A brown wool blanket lay folded across its foot, and clean water filled the jug upon the washstand. Mrs. Fenn, who lived in the first cottage beyond the stone bridge, must have entered during the previous morning to air the room and leave the few provisions Edith had found downstairs. The care had been given quietly, without any expectation that it should be acknowledged at once, and Edith was grateful for it. She opened the window a little. Cool air entered with the scent of wet grass and turned the lace curtain inward. Below, two rust-colored rails passed the station house before curving behind the hawthorn hedge, while beyond them the fields rose gradually towards low hills softened by mist. A few sheep grazed near a stone wall, their movement so slow that Edith could look away and find them almost in the same places when she returned her gaze. When the kettle began to murmur downstairs, she closed the window and went back to the kitchen. She made tea in one of the clean blue-edged cups and ate the bread and cheese Mrs. Fenn had left beneath a cloth. As the daylight thinned, the fire strengthened, filling the room with a mild amber glow that rested upon the dresser, the copper pan, and the worn sleeve of Samuel's coat. Outside, the platform clock continued to show 4:17, while the evening moved quietly beyond it. The rain ceased altogether. Water still slipped from the canopy at regular intervals, and now and then the range gave a soft settling sound as the coal shifted in the grate. Edith unpacked only what she needed, placed her brush and hairpins upon the washstand, and laid her traveling dress across the chair before putting on her nightdress. When she returned briefly to the window, the station had almost disappeared into the blue-grey evening. The rails caught a narrow band of fading light, and the fields beyond them rested beneath a low covering of mist. Edith drew the curtains, placed the wool blanket over the bed, and left the bedroom door slightly open so that a little warmth from below might reach the landing. During the night, the wind moved along the unused rails and made a low, even murmur beneath her window. The sound entered gently into her sleep, carrying with it the memory of journeys made many summers ago, when the carriage had slowed beyond the eastern bend, and Samuel had always been waiting upon the platform. Edith listened for only a little while. The wind travelled onwards across the valley. The old station remained warm around her, and before the last of the sound had passed beyond the fields, she was sleeping again. Edith woke the following morning to the quiet sound of water moving through the gutter beneath the roof. The rain had returned before dawn, though it was no more than a light spring shower, falling steadily enough to darken the platform stones and gather in small drops along the lower edge of the bedroom window. For several minutes she remained beneath the wool blanket, listening to the soft tapping above her and the occasional low murmur of wind passing over the chimney. The room was pale with early light. Her travelling dress lay across the chair where she had placed it the night before, while her oatmeal-coloured coat hung from a hook beside the washstand. Beyond the curtain, the two rails continued through the mist without any sound of wheels upon them. There was no bell to mark the beginning of the station day, and no early train for which the doors must be opened. Yet Edith found herself awake at an hour when Samuel would once have been downstairs, lifting the range lid, consulting his watch, and looking towards the first bend in the line. She rose without haste, washed in the cold water Mrs. Fenn had left, and arranged her chestnut hair into its usual low coil. For the day's work, she chose the pale cornflower blue dress she had packed near the top of her case. Its high collar was made of white muslin, and the sleeves were gathered in small, practical folds at the wrists. Over it, she fastened a cream linen apron with two deep pockets, one of which already held the ring of station keys, and the other a clean handkerchief. The dress had been suitable for long hours spent at a desk, though Edith suspected it would gather dust before the morning was over. She looked at it briefly in the small mirror above the washstand, then turned down the cuffs by half an inch so that the fabric would not brush against the shelves. Downstairs, the kitchen retained a little warmth from the previous evening. A faint red glow remained beneath the ashes in the range, and when Edith opened the grate, she found 2 small coals still holding their heat. She added kindling, waited until the flame had strengthened, and placed the kettle above it. Soon the familiar morning sounds began to fill the room, the gentle drawing of the fire, the low movement of water in the kettle, and the quiet touch of china as she took a cup and plate from the dresser. The simple sequence of tasks made the station house feel less strange. Edith cut 2 slices from the loaf beneath the cloth, warmed them near the range, and ate them with a little butter while standing beside the kitchen window. Outside, the platform clock still showed 17 minutes past 4, although the true hour was nearing 7. The hands no longer seemed as unusual as they had the afternoon before. They belonged to the building now, like the faded signs and the dark green canopy, recording the conclusion of one kind of work while the mornings continued to arrive around them. When Edith had finished breakfast, she washed her cup and plate, dried them, and placed them back upon the dresser. She then removed the railway calendar from the wall and carried it to the table, where the light was better. The calendar remained open at October 1893, the month in which Bramblewick had ceased receiving passengers. Samuel had written several notes in the narrow spaces beneath the printed dates. Some concerned ordinary station matters, a damaged latch on the luggage room door, a delivery of coal, and a loose pane beneath the canopy. Others were shorter and less easily understood. Rain after 3 dry days. First frost near the east wall. Soil still warm beneath ticket window. Edith read each line twice before setting the calendar beside her inventory book. Samuel had always written briefly, leaving out any word that seemed unnecessary, and the notes were no different from the letters he had sent her through the years. She assumed that the remarks about soil concerned the narrow flower beds, though there was nothing to indicate what had been planted or whether anything remained alive beneath the winter leaves. Those questions did not need to be answered that morning. The railway company had asked first for an account of Samuel's private possessions, and Edith had decided to begin with the rooms in which she would be living. She opened her inventory book, dipped her pen into the small bottle of ink she had brought, and ruled several columns across the first page. The work was familiar to her. For many years, she had kept accounts for a cloth merchant, entering purchases, deliveries, and payments into ledgers whose pages differed only in date and quantity. A house could not be recorded quite so neatly, yet the same principles offered a useful beginning. There would be one list for Samuel's personal belongings, another for objects clearly marked as railway property, and a third for anything whose ownership remained uncertain. She began in the kitchen. The oak dresser and the black range belonged to the station house. The blue-edged cups and plates had been supplied by the railway many years before, according to a small inventory folded inside the top drawer. Samuel's copper kettle, however, carried his initials beneath the handle, while 3 worn cookery books and a tin box of tea had plainly been his own. Edith wrote each item carefully, pausing now and then to allow the ink to dry before turning a page. She counted 6 dinner plates, 5 smaller plates, 7 cups, and 8 saucers, one of which had a fine crack near the rim. The uneven number of cups and saucers might once have troubled her, but she merely recorded them as they were and returned each piece to the place where she had found it. The house gradually revealed itself through these small acts of counting. Samuel had owned fewer things than Edith expected. There were no decorative objects beyond a small landscape print above the range and a blue glass bottle upon the kitchen sill. His table drawer contained string, sealing wax, 2 pencils sharpened to different lengths, and several paper packets folded so neatly that Edith left them unopened until she had more room in which to sort them. The station master's coat remained upon its peg. She entered it in the inventory after the kitchen books, describing it simply as one navy uniform coat with brass buttons. His polished boots followed on the next line. When the ink had dried, Edith closed the book for a moment, carried the coal scuttle to the range, and added another piece to the fire. By then, the rain had become lighter. A thin brightness appeared beyond the kitchen window, spreading over the wet stones without yet forming a clear patch of sunlight. Edith placed the inventory book and calendar safely at one end of the table, tied her apron more firmly, and took a broom from the cupboard beneath the stairs. The waiting room was the first of the station rooms she opened. The key turned easily, and the door moved inward with a quiet scrape across the floor. Cool, enclosed air drifted into the passage, carrying the scent of dust, old ashes, and timber that had remained behind closed windows through the winter. Edith stood at the threshold until her eyes adjusted to the dimness. 3 wooden benches rested against the cream-painted walls. Their railway green backs had dulled with age, though the boards remained firm. A small iron fireplace occupied the far wall, and above it hung a framed notice reminding passengers that luggage must not be left unattended. Near the entrance, a cast-iron rack held no coats, while a narrow shelf beneath the window still contained 2 folded timetables from the previous summer. Edith crossed the room and drew back the curtains. The cloth released a faint cloud of dust that rose in the new light before slowly settling again. She opened the window a few inches, and the damp morning entered, with the smell of wet earth and distant grass. The air moved across the benches, touched the cold fireplace, and passed into the corridor behind her. It was a small change, yet the room seemed to respond to it. The grey walls became cream once more, and the green paint upon the benches showed hints of its former colour. Even the brass corners of the framed notice gave back a little light. Edith removed the old ashes from the grate and carried them outside in a metal pan. She swept first around the fireplace, then beneath each bench, and finally along the skirting boards, working in slow, even strokes. Dust and dried leaves gathered into small piles before the broom, along with a railway ticket that had slipped beneath the bench nearest the door. She picked up the ticket and smoothed it against her apron. The printing had faded, but she could still read part of the destination and a date from August 1893. It had probably been dropped by a summer passenger and overlooked during Samuel's final sweep. Edith carried it to the kitchen and placed it in the shallow wooden dish beside the entrance, where several other ticket stubs already rested among the loose buttons and pencil ends. When she returned, The rain had almost stopped. The waiting room window gave a clearer view of the platform, where drops of water trembled upon the bench and the edge of the canopy. Beyond the rails, mist remained low over the meadows, though the stone walls dividing the fields were beginning to appear through it. Edith wiped the 3 benches with a damp cloth, rinsing it several times until the water remained clear. She washed the windowsill and the iron hooks of the coat rack, then folded the old timetables and placed them together at one end of the shelf. She did not light the waiting room fire. The room needed fresh air more than warmth, and the morning was gradually becoming mild enough for the window to remain open. By the time she finished, the waiting room did not look new, nor did Edith wish it to. The marks left by luggage still crossed the lower boards of the benches, and a pale circle showed where a station clock had once hung upon the wall. Yet the dust had gone, the curtains had been shaken, and the room no longer felt sealed away from the day outside. Edith rested both hands upon the broom handle and looked around. She remembered sitting upon one of those benches as a child, with a paper parcel of sandwiches on her lap, while her mother spoke to Samuel in the ticket office. At 10 years old, she had considered the waiting room a place of great importance because everyone who entered it was going somewhere. Now its doors opened onto a platform from which no passenger train would depart, but the room was still sound, and sunlight would still reach its floor when the clouds moved aside. She closed the window only halfway and left the door open. The ticket office required a different key. It was the smallest on the ring and had been marked with a narrow strip of blue thread. When Edith fitted it into the lock, she remembered seeing the same thread around Samuel's keyring during her childhood, replaced whenever it became worn, but always kept in the same color. The door opened into a narrow room divided from the public side by a dark oak counter. A brass-framed ticket window stood above it, its sliding panel closed. Behind the counter were pigeonholes for letters and parcels, a shelf of old ledgers, and a set of shallow drawers that had once held printed tickets arranged by destination. Morning light entered through the south-facing window and fell across the counter in a pale yellow rectangle. Dust lay upon the wood, though not as heavily as it had in the waiting room. Samuel had continued to enter the ticket office after the closure, perhaps to store papers or to look through the window towards the platform. The chair behind the desk remained slightly drawn back, leaving just enough space for him to sit. Edith placed the broom against the wall and began with the brass ticket window. She lifted the latch and slid the panel aside. The mechanism moved smoothly, after a little resistance, revealing the waiting room on the other side. For many years, passengers had stood before that narrow opening to ask the time of a train, purchase a ticket, or inquire about luggage. Now the room beyond was empty, its newly cleaned benches touched by the strengthening daylight. She dampened a cloth and polished the brass frame until the metal showed a quiet, softened gleam. Then she cleaned the glass on both sides, moving from one room to the other so that no mark remained along the edges. When she had finished, light passed through the window, clearly enough to reflect a pale square upon the opposite wall. The desk drawers contained railway forms, bundles of receipts, unused luggage labels, and several date stamps whose rubber faces had hardened. Edith sorted the papers according to year and tied each bundle with string. She did not read every page. Most recorded ordinary journeys and small payments that no longer required attention. Their careful columns, once important to the running of the station, could now be grouped, labelled, and left for Mr. Mercer to examine when the railway sent him to survey the property. One drawer contained Samuel's personal letters mixed among official notices. Edith recognized her own handwriting upon several envelopes and placed them gently to one side. She did not open them. She remembered enough of their contents: a description of early snow, a question about the roof above his kitchen, and an account of the new ledger system introduced at the cloth merchant's office. The letters could be read later, on an evening when the work of the day had ended. For the moment, she tied them together with a narrow piece of cream string and placed them in one of the deep pockets of her apron. As the morning passed, the sound of rainwater in the gutter became less frequent. A pale patch of blue appeared above the western hill, and the stones near the edge of the platform began to dry. Light moved slowly through the ticket office window, warming the oak counter and revealing fine marks made by years of coins, elbows, and travelling bags. Edith arranged the railway papers in 3 piles, then carried the smallest bundle to the kitchen table and added several entries to her inventory. When she looked at the clock on the mantel, she found that midday had arrived without her noticing. She warmed a little milk, cut another slice from Mrs. Fenn's loaf, and ate beside the open kitchen door. The air was still cool, so she draped her butter-yellow woolen shawl around her shoulders before carrying her cup onto the platform. From the green bench, she could see the station as a whole. The building followed the gentle curve of the platform, its stone walls now lighter where the rain had dried. The waiting room door stood open behind her, and the clean ticket office glass reflected part of the sky. Water continued to fall occasionally from the canopy, each drop making a small dark circle upon the stone before disappearing. The railway line extended quietly in both directions. Rust had begun to soften the sides of the rails, though their upper edges still caught the daylight in narrow lines. Grass grew between some of the sleepers, not thickly, but in small green tufts that shifted whenever the wind traveled through the valley. Edith finished her milk and remained seated for a few minutes, allowing her hands to rest around the warm cup. The station no longer required work to be completed according to whistles and timetables. Nothing would be delayed if she sat a little longer. Still, the habit of orderly hours was deeply settled within her, and after the church clock in the village sounded faintly across the fields, she carried her cup inside and returned to the platform with the broom. Leaves had gathered beneath the canopy and along the lower wall of the ticket office. Edith began near the station master's door, drawing them into a loose pile before moving gradually towards the bench. Some were dry enough to lift at the touch of the broom, while others clung to the damp stones and had to be loosened with its edge. The work took her past the narrow flower bed beneath the ticket office window. At first, Edith noticed only the dark winter stems and a covering of flattened leaves. She bent to clear them away, lifting the largest by hand and placing them in the basket she had brought from the kitchen. Beneath the leaves, the soil was darker and softer than the earth elsewhere along the platform. A few green points had emerged near the wall, no taller than the width of her finger. Edith assumed they were ordinary spring weeds and continued working until she saw that the shoots did not grow at random. They formed a narrow row beneath the window. She set down the broom and crouched beside the bed. The wool of her blue skirt gathered around her boots as she used 2 fingers to move the remaining leaves away from the soil. More shoots appeared, each separated from the next by a small, nearly equal space. Some had pushed fully into the air, while others were only beginning to part the surface. Edith did not recognize them. Their leaves were too young, folded closely around themselves, and still carrying grains of earth from their passage upwards. Yet the row was unmistakable. Someone had planted them there carefully before winter, following the edge of the wall from one end of the bed to the other. She remembered the notes upon Samuel's calendar. First frost near the east wall. Soil still warm beneath ticket window. Perhaps he had continued tending the flower beds after the station closed, although there had been no passengers to see them and no timetable to bring people past the window. It was a simple possibility, and Edith did not try to give it any greater meaning. Samuel had always preferred useful habits to explanations. If there was soil near the platform, he would have loosened it. If there were seeds to be planted, he would have found a place for them. Edith brushed a small clump of earth away from one folded leaf and then withdrew her hand. The shoot returned slowly to its upright position. She rose and carried the basket of leaves towards the far end of the platform. Near the green bench, where several bricks had been set into the ground beside the paving stones, she found another cluster of new growth. These shoots were shorter and rounder, emerging between bricks that seemed at first to have shifted with age. When Edith looked more closely, however, she noticed that the spaces had been made deliberately. Several bricks had been lifted and replaced with narrow strips of soil between them. Here, too, the shoots grew in lines. She walked slowly along the platform, keeping close to the wall and looking down. Near the gravelled edge, where the ground was stonier, small tufts of grey-green leaves had begun to spread in a low band. Farther along, beneath the section of wall that received the clearest afternoon light, another row was only just appearing. The growth was quiet and easily overlooked, particularly beneath the dead leaves, yet it continued for much of the length of the building. Edith returned to the ticket office window. From there she could see that the separate beds were not joined together like those of a formal garden. One occupied the earth beneath the wall, another followed the platform edge, and a third rested near the bench. Each had been placed where space could be found among the practical parts of the station. She wondered how long Samuel had worked upon them, and whether he had begun before or after the railway announced the closure. The calendar might contain more notes, though it gave no names to the plants. The papers in the ticket office were unlikely to explain them. For now, the only clear information lay in the soil itself. The shoots had been planted in rows. They had survived the winter, and the warmer weather had begun to draw them upwards. The afternoon light grew brighter as Edith continued sweeping. She worked more carefully around the beds, removing only the largest leaves and leaving a thin covering over the softer ground. By the time she reached the eastern end of the platform, the stones behind her were clean, the waiting room was airing, and the ticket office window reflected the pale blue sky. Her shoulders had begun to ache from the broom, and a light film of dust rested along the front of her cream apron. There was also a narrow mark of soil upon one finger where she had touched the first chute. Edith rubbed it gently with her thumb, but did not remove it entirely. Before going inside, she stood near the green bench and looked back along the platform. The station remained quiet. Nothing had altered in the still clock, the empty rails, or the signs above the doors. Yet the open windows and swept stones had softened the stillness around them. The building no longer seemed merely closed. It seemed to be receiving the morning air again after a long winter. Edith carried the basket and broom into the passage, washed her hands, and added 2 more pieces of coal to the range. She left the waiting room door open until the light began to fade, then closed the window, drew the curtain straight, and turned the key in the lock. In the ticket office, she gathered the bundles of paper from the desk and placed them neatly upon the upper shelf. There were still cupboards to examine, drawers to empty, and the dark space beneath the oak counter to clean, but those could wait until the following day. 6 weeks offered enough time if each room was taken in order. She closed the brass ticket panel, wiped the last dust from the counter, and stood for a moment beside the south-facing window. Below it, the small green shoots formed a quiet row in the dark earth. In the fading light, they were scarcely more than shadows, yet now that Edith knew where they were, she could see them clearly. That evening, she entered a few final items into the inventory before setting down her pen. Beside the list of books, clothes, and household possessions, she made one brief note for herself in the margin. Young plants beneath ticket office window. Leave undisturbed. The kettle murmured upon the range. Samuel's coat remained quietly on its peg, and the cleaned cup waited among the others upon the dresser. Outside, a little rain began again, settling softly over the platform and into the narrow rows of soil between the old stones. Edith listened while it watered the unseen roots. Then she closed the inventory book, drew her chair nearer to the fire, and allowed the work of the empty station to rest until morning. The following morning brought no rain, though the valley remained pale beneath a low covering of mist. Water still clung to the platform canopy and gathered along the edges of the narrow flower beds, where the young shoots Edith had uncovered stood upright in the dark earth. From the kitchen window, they appeared scarcely larger than green stitches set carefully beneath the ticket office wall. After breakfast, Edith tied on her cream linen apron and carried the inventory book into the station rooms. She opened the waiting room curtains to admit the morning light, then unlocked the ticket office with the smallest key on Samuel's ring. The room no longer seemed quite as closed as it had the day before. The polished brass around the ticket window held a quiet gleam, and the bundles of railway papers rested in orderly piles upon the upper shelf. Only the lower part of the room remained untouched, the space beneath the oak counter, the footrest behind Samuel's chair, and several narrow recesses too dark to examine without kneeling. Edith set the inventory book upon the desk and began with the lowest drawer. Damp had swollen the wood, and it moved reluctantly beneath her hands. Inside were several lengths of string, a dried block of sealing wax, 2 empty coin bags, and a wooden tray divided into small compartments. She recorded the objects without unnecessary detail, wiped the drawer, and returned everything to its place. Beneath the desk, dust had gathered around the station master's footrest. Edith moved it aside and swept carefully along the skirting board. The broom drew out 2 ticket clippings, a broken pencil, and several dry leaves that had become pale and brittle in the darkness. Farther beneath the counter, beyond the reach of the broom head, something caught against the handle. Edith crouched and looked into the recess. At first, she saw only the curled edges of several old railway posters and the corner of a wooden box. She placed a folded cloth beneath her knees, drew out the posters, and laid them carefully against the wall. Behind them was a small collection of brushes, a hammer, and a tin of dried black paint. When those had been removed, she noticed another object resting close to the rear wall. Using the broom handle, Edith eased it forward until it reached the light. It was a rectangular tin box, no wider than 2 hands, placed side by side. Most of its original decoration had faded, though part of a painted gold border remained upon the lid. A narrow strip of green paint ran around one edge, applied by hand rather than by the manufacturer. Dust covered the upper surface, but the sides were dry, and there was no rust around the seam. A piece of string had been wound twice around the box and fastened with a simple knot. Edith lifted the tin onto the counter. She did not suppose Samuel had intended to conceal it. The recess beneath the desk was simply one of the driest places in the ticket office, protected from the rain that sometimes reached the south-facing window. The posters and tools had probably accumulated in front of it during the years. She loosened the knot with the point of a pencil and placed the string beside the inventory book. The lid resisted for a moment before opening with a faint metallic sound. Inside were rows of folded paper packets. Some had been made from brown wrapping paper. Others had been cut from old timetables, envelopes, and unused railway notices. Each packet was folded firmly enough to remain closed without glue, and Samuel's handwriting appeared along the upper edges. Edith lifted the nearest one, Robin Hood's Bay. Beneath the place name, Samuel had written Sea Thrift. Gravel by platform edge. Edith glanced through the south-facing window towards the low gray-green plants she had noticed among the stones. Their position matched the note, though they were still too small to show any flowers. The next packet carried the words, York, morning service. Below them was another brief instruction, red poppy, open ground, beyond bench. A third had been labeled, heather from the moor, late train. Other packets were marked not by places, but by the people who had given them. The school mistress with the blue case, 2 children traveling to the coast, woman in red shawl, seeds from Cottage Gate. Samuel had written no names and no stories. He had recorded only the detail that had allowed him to remember each exchange, a destination, a particular train, the color of a coat, or the object a passenger had carried. Edith placed the packets upon the counter in the order she removed them. There were more than 30 in the upper rows, though she examined only a few. Some felt almost empty, while others held enough seed to shift faintly when turned in her hand. Several carried dates written in different inks, suggesting that Samuel had opened them more than once. Until then, Edith had thought of the narrow beds as a private garden made beside the station after the work of the railway had ended. The labels suggested something quieter and more gradual. The flowers had arrived over many years, carried in pockets, baskets, and folded pieces of paper by people passing through Bramblewick. Samuel had kept enough of each gift to remember where it had come from, then found a suitable place for it among the stones. She opened her inventory book and wrote, "One tin containing packets of flower seed, labeled by place, train, or circumstance of receipt, kept by Samuel Marlowe." When the ink had dried, Edith returned to the box. The older packets lay farther down. Samuel's handwriting became narrower, while the paper appeared softer along the folds. Some labels had been repaired with thread. Others had been copied onto cleaner wrappers, as though the words mattered more than the paper upon which they had first been written. Near the center of the tin, Edith found several wooden markers tied together. Soil still darkened their pointed ends, but most of the painted lettering had faded. One retained part of a place name, another showed only a time ending in 45. She did not attempt to match them with the beds outside. The young plants had only begun to emerge, and there would be time to understand their arrangement when they grew. Beneath the markers lay a piece of clean muslin covering the bottom of the box. Edith paused before lifting it. 6 smaller packets had been laid flat underneath, separate from the others. They were square rather than narrow, and each appeared to have been preserved with particular care. The first was marked with the year 1859 and referred to the station's earliest garden. The second carried the name of a signal box farther north. Another mentioned the summer in which the Bramblewick waiting room had been repainted. Edith read each label, then returned it to the counter. The final packet remained alone in the bottom of the tin. It was wrapped in cream-colored paper and secured with a narrow length of blue thread, the same shade Samuel had used to mark the ticket office key. The folds had softened with age, though the packet itself was clean and unbroken. Edith lifted it carefully. At first, she assumed the writing named another passenger or destination. Then she moved nearer to the window, where the light was stronger. The first word was her own name, Edith. Beneath it, Samuel had written, "Summer 1862." She remained beside the ticket window, with the packet resting across her open palm. Edith had been 10 years old in the summer of 1862. She remembered visiting Bramblewick with her mother and sleeping in the small room above the kitchen. There had been warm days, the smell of smoke upon Samuel's uniform, and long afternoons spent upon the green platform bench while trains crossed the valley. Something else waited at the edge of the memory, faint and unfinished. She could not yet see its shape clearly. Edith did not loosen the blue thread. Outside, the morning light touched the narrow row of chutes beneath the window. The station clock remained fixed at 17 minutes past 4, while somewhere beyond the mist, the true hour continued quietly forward. On the counter before her lay the names of distant places, forgotten trains and travellers who had once paused at Bramblewick, and among them, preserved at the bottom of Samuel's tin, was a summer bearing her own name. Edith left the packet marked with her name unopened. Before locking the ticket office that evening, she returned it to the bottom of the tin, beneath the piece of muslin and the newer packets Samuel had arranged above it. She placed the box upon a dry shelf inside the desk cupboard, rather than returning it to the recess beneath the counter. The packet belonged to a summer more than 30 years past, and although fragments of that visit had begun to stir in her memory, she felt no need to hurry them into completeness. The following morning was brighter. The mist had withdrawn towards the lower fields, leaving drops of water upon the rails and a pale band of sunlight along the eastern end of the platform. Edith had just opened the kitchen door when she saw a woman approaching from the lane with a covered jug in one hand and a cloth-wrapped loaf beneath her arm. Mrs. Fenn was a small, broad-shouldered woman who lived at the nearest farm beyond the stone bridge. Edith remembered her from Samuel's funeral, though they had spoken only briefly in the churchyard. Her grey hair was drawn into a firm knot, and the hem of her brown skirt carried the dark marks of the wet lane. "I thought you might need milk," she said when Edith went to meet her, "and the bread was baked this morning." Edith thanked her and carried both into the kitchen. The jug was still cool from the dairy, while the loaf retained enough warmth to soften the cloth around it. Mrs. Fenn declined to sit down at first, saying that she had left work waiting at home, but she remained near the open door while Edith found a clean bottle for the milk. From where she stood, Mrs. Fenn could see across the passage and through the waiting room to the platform beyond. Her attention settled upon the narrow beds between the old stones. "You have begun clearing Samuel's garden." "Only the earth beneath the ticket office window," Edith replied. Most of it was covered with leaves. Mrs. Fenn stepped outside. Edith followed her along the platform, where the morning light made every wet stone appear darker at its edges. Near the platform wall, the rows of young plants stood more clearly than before. Their leaves were narrow and gathered close to the ground, each cluster forming a small grey-green tuft among the gravel. Mrs. Fenn bent to examine them without touching the leaves. "Sea thrift," she said. "It will carry pink flowers later, if the winter has not taken too much from it." Edith remembered the first package she had lifted from Samuel's tin. Robin Hood's Bay. Sea thrift, gravel by platform edge. She had trusted the words because they were written in Samuel's hand. Hearing the plant named by someone else made the garden seem less like a collection of notes and more like something still living beneath them. Did Samuel grow many kinds of flowers here, more than anyone knew the names of? Mrs. Fenn straightened and looked towards the waiting room steps. There was always something beginning after something else had finished. Edith asked whether Samuel had bought the seeds in Bramblewick or ordered them from a nursery. Mrs. Fenn shook her head. Never saw him buy a packet. She offered no further explanation. Perhaps she did not know where the seeds had come from, or perhaps their arrival had seemed too ordinary to require one. She remembered Samuel carrying folded papers in his coat pocket and setting shallow dishes upon the ticket office sill during dry weather. Sometimes seed heads had been left there for several days before disappearing into the room behind the brass window. Mrs. Fenn walked slowly towards the green bench. Most of the bed beside it remained bare, except for a few reddish stems breaking through the soil. She pointed out where blue flowers had grown the previous year and where a taller white plant had stood near the wall. She did not know their proper names. Samuel had known them, though he rarely spoke of the garden unless someone asked. "He kept little markers," she said, "wooden ones. They used to stand all along here." Edith had seen no markers when she first arrived. She looked closely at the nearest bed and noticed a short, dark fragment projecting from the soil. It might have been mistaken for a broken twig, but one side was flat and showed the remains of pale paint. She loosened the earth around it with her fingers and lifted it out. Only the pointed end remained. The upper part, where a name might once have been written, had broken away. Mrs. Fenn took the empty jug and tucked it beneath her arm. Before leaving, she looked once more at the grey-green plants by the platform edge. "They always manage better than they appear to," she said. "That thrift especially." Edith watched her cross the yard and return to the lane. Then she carried the bread and milk into the kitchen, placing the loaf upon the oak board and the bottle in the coolest part of the pantry. The house felt quieter after the visit, though no longer quite so separate from the village. Mrs. Fenn had spoken of Samuel as someone whose small habits had continued within the notice of others, even when they had not entirely understood them. After breakfast, Edith returned to the platform with the broken piece of wood. Several outbuildings stood beyond the station house: a coal shed, a narrow store beside the former luggage room, and a smaller structure where Samuel had kept tools for the platform and garden. She had glanced inside during her first inspection, but had not yet made an inventory of its contents. The door opened reluctantly. Damp earth had gathered beneath it during the winter, and Edith had to press with one shoulder before the lower edge moved across the floor. Inside, a rake and a spade rested against the stone wall. There were coils of wire, 2 empty lamp oil cans, and several shallow wooden trays stacked beneath a shelf. A smell of soil, old timber, and cold iron lingered in the enclosed air. Edith opened the small window above the workbench. Light fell across a row of flower pots, a ball of garden twine, and a square tin containing nails of different sizes. Beneath the bench stood a wooden seed tray covered by a folded piece of sacking. When she lifted the cloth, she found the old markers. There were more than 20 of them, some long and narrow, others cut from scraps of packing wood. Soil stained their pointed ends, showing how deeply they had once stood in the beds. Most of the writing had faded, but traces remained beneath the dirt. A few letters, part of a place name, the beginning of a flower, and several railway times written in Samuel's careful hand. Edith carried the tray outside and placed it upon the green bench. She did not attempt to restore the words. Cleaning the wood too firmly might remove what little paint remained. Instead, she wiped each marker with a dry cloth and laid them side by side, grouping those of similar length and color. The earth provided more guidance than she expected. Along the beds were narrow depressions where the winter rain had settled into old holes. In several places, small pieces of wood still remained beneath the surface. One broken marker fitted neatly against a buried fragment. Another carried the same pale blue paint as a splinter found beside the waiting room steps. Near the platform edge, Edith discovered a line of 3 holes among the gravel, each spaced evenly between the young tufts of sea thrift. She worked slowly, moving from one bed to the next. Whenever the evidence was uncertain, she left the marker upon the bench. She would not place it merely to make the garden appear complete, but where the shape of a hole, the color of a fragment, or the surviving line in the soil gave a clear indication, she pressed the wooden point back into its former position. By midday, 7 markers stood along the platform. Their lettering was too faint to be read from a distance. Some appeared almost blank, weathered to the same grey as the stones around them. Yet their presence restored a quiet order to the beds. Each suggested that the bare spaces were not empty and that the scattered shoots did not grow without relation to one another. Edith stood at the ticket office window and looked outside. From there, she could see how the markers divided the ground into small sections. The marks left in the earth had survived the winter even after the wood had been removed. Roots, stones, and rain had preserved their places with greater patience than any written inventory. She thought of the packets in Samuel's tin, each carrying the name of a town, a train, or a traveler. For now, she did not try to match them with every bed. That understanding could wait until the plants had grown large enough to reveal themselves. Before returning the unused markers to the store, Edith placed them in the order in which she had found them. The broken fragment from the sea thrift bed went on top. She covered the tray with the sacking but left it near the door, where it could be reached again. Outside, the breeze passed lightly over the platform. The young thrift leaves trembled among the gravel, and the restored markers cast thin shadows across the dark soil. The garden had lost many of its names during the winter, but the earth had remembered where they belonged. The 7 wooden markers remained in the earth overnight. When Edith stepped onto the platform the following morning, each stood exactly where she had placed it, darkened by dew and casting a narrow shadow across the soil. The faded writing was still difficult to read, but in the clear April light, she noticed that several markers carried numbers rather than flower names. One showed part of a time, 7:20. Another, near the waiting room steps, appeared to read 10:45. A third bore only the final 2 figures of an hour that had almost disappeared beneath the weathered grain. Edith had first assumed the numbers referred to sowing times or dates. Yet Samuel would scarcely have needed to record the precise hour at which seeds were placed in the ground. The numbers looked instead like entries from a railway timetable. She returned to the ticket office and opened the cupboard beneath the desk. The seed tin rested safely upon the upper shelf, separate from the railway papers she had already sorted. Edith removed it and carried it to the counter, hoping that one of the packets might explain the figures on the markers. The labels offered only partial clues. Several referred to morning or afternoon trains, and one mentioned a departure shortly after noon, but there was no complete list of times. Edith replaced the packets without disturbing the cream-colored one tied with blue thread. Samuel must have recorded the arrangement elsewhere. She spent the rest of the morning examining the remaining papers in the ticket office. Most belonged entirely to the railway: old freight accounts, notices concerning winter delays, lists of parcels never collected, and bundles of tickets left unused when the station closed. Nothing referred to the garden. Only after she had cleared the lowest shelf beside Samuel's chair did Edith notice a narrow gap between the back of the cupboard and the wall. A book had slipped into it and remained upright in the dust. She eased it out with a wooden ruler. The book was bound in dark green cloth, faded almost grey along the spine. It was taller than Samuel's ordinary account ledgers, but thin enough to fit inside the pocket of his railway coat. The corners had softened through years of handling, and a loop of string had been fixed inside the cover to hold a short pencil. Across the front, Samuel had written, "Bramblewick, train times." Edith carried the book to the window. The opening pages contained exactly what the cover promised. Samuel had listed the passenger and goods services that stopped at Bramblewick, beginning with the early train from the north and ending with the evening service that crossed the valley after dusk. The entries were brief and orderly. 7:20, morning passenger. 8:35, milk cans collected. 10:45, market train. 12:10, goods service. 2:30, afternoon passenger. 4:17, westbound connection. 6:05, final passenger. Some times had been crossed out and replaced when the railway company altered its schedule. Others were accompanied by short notes concerning delays, winter fog, or the number of carriages expected during market week. Edith recognized the neat columns from the timetables that had once hung in the waiting room. She also recognized several numbers from the wooden markers outside. She turned another page. The columns continued, but their purpose began to change. Beside the 7:20 train, Samuel had written, "Sea thrift, gravel dry, new growth after rain." Beside the 10:45 market service, blue bellflowers, shade until midday. Below the afternoon passenger train appeared a note about pale campion opening against the warm wall. The final service of the day was followed by an observation concerning lavender and the length of evening light. Edith read the entries again. The handwriting was Samuel's, but the book no longer resembled an ordinary railway record. Dates of departures were followed by dates of sowing. Notes about fog and rain appeared beside descriptions of soil. The expected arrival of a goods train shared a page with the first opening of a flower. She moved farther into the book. One spring, Samuel had recorded 3 days of steady rain and the failure of several seeds near the bench. The next year, he had written that the same ground remained too wet until late April. A later page noted that pink flowers had opened 6 days after the first warm morning, while white flowers beneath the ticket office window had continued through most of June. He had recorded colors with particular care. Deep blue beside waiting room wall, pale yellow after midday, white beneath south window, pink along platform edge. There were no drawings, yet Edith began to see the garden through the arrangement of the words. The sea thrift belonged near the first morning service. The bellflowers stood where the market train had once stopped. Taller plants occupied the hours of the afternoon, while lavender and white campion marked the final departures. She took the book outside. Beginning at the eastern end of the platform, Edith compared the first page of train times with the surviving markers. The faded 7:20 marker stood among the grey-green sea thrift. The one marked 10:45 belonged beside the waiting room steps, exactly where Samuel had recorded blue bellflowers. Near the green bench, a damaged marker matched the afternoon service listed in the book. The spaces were arranged in the same order as the trains. Edith moved slowly along the platform, holding the green book open in both hands. Each bed corresponded to another part of the railway day. The garden began with the morning passenger at one end of the station and continued towards the final evening service at the other. Samuel had not merely planted flowers wherever the soil allowed. He had used the old timetable to decide where each group should stand. The platform had once measured the day through whistles, wheels, and the opening of carriage doors. After the last train departed, Samuel had preserved those hours in another form. A flower opening beside a marker had taken the place of an arrival. Seed, gathered at the end of summer, had replaced the bundles of used tickets once collected from the office. Edith sat on the green bench and laid the book beside her. From that position, the garden still appeared incomplete. Many beds remained bare, and most of the surviving shoots were too small to identify. Yet the empty spaces no longer seemed without purpose. They belonged to hours that had not yet reached their season. She returned to the store and brought out the unused wooden markers. With the green book as her guide, she examined them again. A faint number invisible the previous day became legible when compared with Samuel's list. Another marker retained only the beginning of a word, but its length and paint matched a broken piece still buried beside the western wall. Edith restored 4 more markers before the afternoon light began to fade. Those she could not identify remained in the tray. She would wait until the plants grew, or another entry in the book offered clearer guidance. At the ticket office desk, she opened her inventory and recorded the discovery. 1 timetable book, green cloth, train times followed by records of sowing, weather, flowering, and position of beds. She paused, then added another line. Also serves as plan of station garden. Edith left the book beside the seed tin rather than placing it among the railway ledgers. The timetable belonged to both parts of Samuel's life and could not be understood if separated from either. Before closing the waiting room, she stood behind the brass ticket window and looked along the platform. The markers now formed a quiet sequence through the garden. Morning began near the gravel, past the waiting room steps, and continued towards the green bench before reaching the western end of the station. No train moved between those hours now. Only the light traveled across the beds, touching each one in turn. Samuel's timetable had not ended when the railway closed. It had simply begun keeping a different kind of time. The following morning, Edith carried Samuel's green timetable book into the kitchen and placed it beside her breakfast plate. Rain had begun before dawn, but it was light and steady, scarcely more than a fine silver movement against the window. Beyond the glass, the station garden appeared darker than it had the previous evening. The restored markers stood among the wet beds, keeping the order of trains that no longer came. Edith opened the book at the pages for the summer of 1862. The first entries contained the usual railway times. The morning passenger had arrived 3 minutes late on one day and 5 minutes early on another. Milk cans had been collected beneath clear skies. The afternoon service had been delayed after rain farther along the line. Between those notices, Samuel had written smaller observations about the garden. Daisies beneath south window, seed brought by Edith, sown after evening rain. A later line recorded the appearance of the first leaves. Another noted that several plants had survived the winter beside the wall. The following summer, Samuel had gathered their dry flower heads and placed the seed in a fresh section of the same bed. Edith read the entries slowly. The memory that had remained incomplete since she found the cream-colored packet now returned in quiet pieces. She had been 10 years old when she came to Bramblewick that summer. At home, the daisies in her mother's garden had grown along a low path where the soil was thin and pale. Some still carried white petals, while others had already dried beneath the July sun. Before Edith left for the station, her mother had gathered several of the brown seed heads and wrapped them in a square of cream paper. Edith remembered holding the packet throughout the journey. It had been light enough to forget, and important enough that she had repeatedly placed one hand over her pocket to make certain it remained there. When she arrived at Bramblewick, Samuel had been standing beneath the canopy. His uniform was dark and neatly brushed, and a watch chain crossed the front of his waistcoat. Behind him, the rails shone in the afternoon light. Edith had expected the station to be grander, though she had not said so. There was only one platform, a small waiting room, and a green bench beneath the ticket office window. She had given Samuel the packet before entering the house. The memory contained no important conversation. She could not recall the exact words either of them had spoken. She remembered only Samuel turning the paper carefully in his hands and reading the name her mother had written upon it. Then he had asked Edith where she thought the daisies ought to grow. Edith had chosen the ground beneath the south-facing window because it received the longest light. The bed had been narrow even then, confined between the wall and the edge of the paving stones. Samuel had loosened the soil with a small hand fork while Edith separated the dry seed heads upon her palm. They had scattered the seeds together. Afterwards, Samuel had pressed the earth gently with the back of the fork. There had been no rain that afternoon, so Edith had carried water from the kitchen in a white enamel jug. Most of it had fallen too quickly from the spout, making a shallow hollow in the soil. Samuel had leveled the earth again without complaint. The daisies had not appeared while Edith remained at Bramblewick. By the time the first small leaves emerged, she had already returned home. She had thought of them occasionally during the following winter, but the years had gradually placed other things around the memory. The packet, the enamel jug, and the strip of soil beneath the window had become too small to survive among all that came afterwards. Samuel had remembered them. Edith turned the page. The daisies appeared again in his notes for 1863. He had recorded their first flowers, the length of their stems, and the number that survived a dry period in June. At the end of the summer, he gathered their seeds. In 1864, he sowed them again. The entries did not continue every year without interruption. Some seasons had been too wet. In another, only 3 plants returned. Once, Samuel moved them farther from the wall after water from the roof damaged the young leaves. Yet whenever the daisies weakened, he saved enough seed to begin again. The paper packet Edith had carried as a child could not have contained the seeds now resting in the tin. Those first seeds had grown, flowered, and disappeared long ago. The seeds in the cream packet had come from later plants, and those plants from others before them. Samuel had kept her name upon each new wrapping, carrying it from one summer into the next. Edith closed the timetable book and remained at the kitchen table while the rain softened outside. Nothing Samuel had done was remarkable when considered separately. He had gathered dry flower heads, folded paper, and written a name. Each task could have been completed in a few minutes, yet those minutes had been repeated across more than 30 summers. When the rain ended near midday, Edith returned to the ticket office. She took the tin from the upper shelf and removed the packets one row at a time. Beneath the muslin lay the cream-colored square tied with blue thread. Edith, summer 1862. She carried it to the green bench and sat with the packet resting upon her lap. The platform stones remained wet, but a pale brightness had begun to gather above the western fields. Water hung from the edge of the canopy and fell at slow intervals into the gutter. For the first time, Edith loosened the thread. The paper opened along folds, softened by years of handling. Inside lay a small quantity of daisy seeds, mixed with fragments of dry flower heads. They were lighter and less impressive than she had imagined. A breath of wind might have lifted them from the paper and carried them between the sleepers. Edith folded the sides inward again and walked to the bed beneath the ticket office window. Several green shoots already occupied the ground there. Some might have been Samuel's daisies, though it was still too early to distinguish them clearly. She would not disturb their roots, merely to place the packet where the first seeds had once been sown. Beside the green bench, however, one small section of soil remained empty. The green timetable book showed that Samuel had cleared it during the previous autumn, but no sowing date had been entered. The earth was dark after the rain and protected from the strongest wind by the back of the bench. Edith fetched Samuel's hand fork from the garden store. She loosened only the surface, removing 2 small stones and a length of dead root. Then she drew several shallow lines through the soil. She returned to the bench for the packet. The seeds made almost no sound as she scattered them. A few fell together and had to be separated with the tip of one finger. Others disappeared immediately against the dark earth. Edith covered them with the lightest layer of soil and pressed it gently with the back of the fork, just as Samuel had done beneath the south window more than 30 years before. No water was needed. The rain had already provided enough. Edith carried the empty paper into the ticket office, but did not discard it. She folded it along its old creases, wound the blue thread around it, and returned it to the bottom of the tin. Then she opened the green book. Beneath Samuel's final entry for the daisies, she wrote the date and added a single line in her own hand. Seeds marked Edith, sown beside green bench after morning rain. The writing looked unfamiliar among Samuel's narrow letters. Edith waited for the ink to dry before closing the book. Outside, the newly sown bed appeared unchanged. There were no leaves, no flowers, and no sign that anything had been placed beneath its surface. Only the faint lines made by the fork distinguished it from the surrounding earth. Edith stood beside the bench for a little while. The seeds no longer belonged only to the summer of 1862. They had been given another season. During the days that followed, the small bed beside the green bench showed no sign of change. Each morning, Edith examined the dark surface before beginning her work in the station rooms. Though she knew the daisy seeds could not yet have produced anything visible, the faint lines made by Samuel's hand fork had already softened beneath 2 nights of rain, and only the cream packet, folded once more beneath its blue thread, proved that anything had been sown there. The rest of the garden continued to emerge slowly. The sea thrift along the platform edge held its grey-green leaves close to the gravel. Near the waiting room steps, several rounded shoots unfolded beneath one of the restored markers. Other beds remained bare, their place in Samuel's green book more certain than their place in the spring earth. Edith had nearly finished sorting the parcel records one morning when she heard footsteps crossing the yard. The sound was too light and uneven to belong to a railway porter and too slow to suggest anyone arriving in haste. Even so, it traveled through the waiting room in a manner that made Edith lift her head from the desk. An elderly man appeared in the open doorway. He wore a dark coat, polished at the cuffs, and carried a brown cap in both hands. His shoulders had rounded with age, but his trousers still held the neat crease of a railway uniform. Before entering, he looked towards the western bend of the tracks, as though an approaching train might explain why the door stood open. Edith recognized Mr. Alden from Samuel's funeral. He had worked as the porter at Bramblewick for more than 20 years, carrying trunks, milk cans, baskets and parcels between the platform and the luggage room. He had retired shortly before the station closed, though the habit of arriving by the yard gate rather than the front path remained with him. "I saw the markers from the lane," he said. "They have not stood there since autumn." Edith invited him inside and explained how she had found them beneath the sacking in Samuel's garden store. Mr. Alden walked slowly along the platform, pausing at several beds without stepping from the bricks. He recognized some of the markers despite their faded lettering. Others seemed to call forth memories only after he had stood beside them for a little while. Near the sea thrift, he remembered a family returning from the coast, with salt still dried upon their boots. The mother had carried a paper parcel of shells for her younger children, while her eldest daughter held a small cloth bag filled with seed heads gathered from a path above the shore. Samuel had placed the seeds among the gravel because the girl told him the flowers at the coast grew where the ground was stony and the wind rarely stopped. Beside the waiting room steps, Mr. Alden recalled a schoolmistress who travelled each summer to visit her sister beyond York. One year she returned with blue bellflower seeds wrapped in the unused half of her railway ticket. Samuel had accepted the packet through the brass window, written the place and train upon it, then left it on the ticket office sill until the seeds were fully dry. The memories were not complete stories. Mr. Alden did not remember the exact year in which the girl had brought the sea thrift or the name of the schoolmistress's sister. He remembered luggage more clearly than faces, a blue case with a broken handle, a basket tied with red cord, a child's wooden spade still carrying sand between its teeth. Yet each object belonged to a packet Edith had seen in Samuel's tin. She brought the box from the ticket office and placed it upon the green bench. Mr. Alden lowered himself onto the far end while Edith opened the lid. He recognized several labels before she read them aloud. The two children traveling to the coast had been brother and sister, though he could no longer remember their surname. The woman in the red shawl had changed trains at Bramblewick every other Thursday to visit her married daughter. The heather, marked late train, had arrived in the pocket of a young farm worker returning from several weeks upon the moors. Samuel had rarely asked passengers to bring him anything. He had simply listened when they spoke about where they had been. Once people understood that he kept a garden beside the platform, they began returning with small offerings that required almost no room in a coat pocket or travelling bag. Some brought nursery packets purchased in market towns. Others brought dried seed heads from relatives' gardens, pieces of paper folded around berries or husks shaken from plants growing beside distant walls. Samuel accepted each gift with the same practical care. He wrote where it had come from, asked what kind of ground the plant preferred, and waited until the proper season before sowing it. Mr. Alden lifted a narrow packet marked only "Woman with Willow Basket, Afternoon Service." He turned it over and found a second note written upon the back, "Bramblewick wallflower given in exchange." Edith had not noticed the line when she first examined the tin. Mr. Alden explained that Samuel did not only receive seeds. By late summer, shallow dishes often covered the ticket office sill. Samuel dried flower heads there, separated the seed, and folded it into small packets made from old railway notices. Some were kept in the tin. Others were handed through the ticket window to passengers who admired the garden or asked whether a particular flower might grow elsewhere. A woman travelling north had once carried Bramblewick wallflower seeds to a cottage near Durham. A railway guard had taken calendula seeds home to his wife. Mr. Alden himself had delivered a packet of pale campion to his sister when he visited her after Christmas. The flowers had grown beside her wash-house for several years, though he did not know whether any remained. While they spoke, Mrs. Fenn crossed the yard, carrying an empty milk jug. She had seen Mr. Alden from the lane and came to the platform rather than going directly to the kitchen. When Edith showed her the note upon the wallflower packet, Mrs. Fenn remembered receiving seeds from the same bed. Samuel had given them to her when a stretch of bare earth appeared beside the stone wall at the farm. The first sowing had failed during a wet spring, but the following year 3 plants returned. Their descendants still grew near the dairy door. Mrs. Fenn had also carried seeds away from Bramblewick for other people. A small packet had gone to a cousin who lived beyond Harrogate. Another had been placed inside a letter to an aunt who could no longer travel. The contents had cost nothing, and no one had thought of the exchange as unusual enough to record outside Samuel's book. Before Mrs. Fenn left, another villager appeared at the yard gate. He had come to ask whether Edith required help moving a broken coal bin, but remained when he saw the open seed tin. He remembered taking yellow poppy seeds from Bramblewick to his daughter's new house after her marriage. In return, she later sent Samuel the seeds of a white flower that grew beside her kitchen path. For a short while, the closed station held the low murmur of people remembering journeys. They stood at different places along the platform as they spoke. Mr. Alden remained beside the luggage room door. Mrs. Fenn rested one hand upon the back of the green bench. The other man paused near the waiting room steps, looking down at a bed where only 2 leaves had emerged. Names had disappeared, years had become uncertain, and journeys once made for serious reasons were now recalled through small details. A parcel leaking rainwater, a basket that smelled of apples, the color of flowers growing beyond an unfamiliar gate. Yet the fragments were enough. Each memory connected one of Samuel's packets to a person who had passed through the station. Edith began turning the packets over one by one. Several carried notes upon their backs. Bramblewick seed sent west, pink thrift exchanged for white campion, for station garden beyond Whitby, given to passenger travelling to Leeds. The tin was not merely a record of what Bramblewick had received, it was also a record of what the station had given away. When the visitors departed, Mr. Alden was the last to leave. He stood at the eastern end of the platform and looked along the 2 rails, which had begun to darken beneath another approaching shower. He seemed smaller against the empty line than he had appeared inside the waiting room. For years, he said, people had believed the trains carried everything important through Bramblewick: passengers, letters, milk, livestock, and news from places beyond the valley. Samuel had understood that smaller things travelled with them as well. After Mr. Alden crossed the yard, Edith returned the seed tin to the ticket office. She did not replace it immediately upon the shelf. Instead, she sat behind the oak counter and examined the packets in the afternoon light. A seed from the coast had grown beside the platform. Seeds gathered from that plant might then have been carried to another village. Flowers from Bramblewick had appeared beside cottages whose owners had never seen the station, while pieces of distant gardens had rooted themselves between its bricks. The railway had joined those places for only a few minutes at a time. A passenger stepped down, waited beneath the canopy, changed trains or handed a folded packet through the brass window. Then the whistle sounded, the doors closed, and the journey continued. Samuel had preserved something from each brief pause. Edith arranged the packets as she had found them and lowered the muslin over the older ones. At the bottom lay the empty paper bearing her own name. Its seeds were now beside the green bench, beginning another quiet connection between her mother's garden, the summer of 1862, and the spring earth of Bramblewick. Outside, the platform had become empty again. The restored markers stood among the young leaves, and the rails stretched away in both directions beneath the soft April rain. The last train had already passed through Bramblewick, but for many years its garden had been travelling both ways. The days at Bramblewick did not pass according to the stopped clock above the waiting room door. Its hands remained at 17 minutes past 4, unchanged by the pale mornings that entered through the eastern windows or by the lengthening evenings that rested upon the rails. Edith no longer looked towards it when she wished to know the hour. She learned instead to notice where the light had reached along the platform, which part of the station wall had begun to warm, and how far the shadow of the canopy extended across the garden beds. By the middle of April, she had established a quiet order for her work. She rose, while the fields beyond the line were still covered with mist, lit the kitchen fire, and carried a cup of tea into the ticket office. The first hour of the morning belonged to Samuel's papers. She examined household accounts, old railway correspondence, and receipts preserved long after they had ceased to be useful. Items that would eventually leave Bramblewick were entered in her inventory. Objects belonging to the station were listed separately. Samuel's green timetable book and the seed tin remained together on the upper shelf of the desk cupboard, where Edith could reach them without disturbing the bundles below. When the sun began to touch the platform, she went outside. At first, the garden required very little from her. The soil was still damp from spring rain, and the young plants needed protection more than intervention. Edith removed weeds only when she was certain they did not belong to one of Samuel's beds. She loosened the earth where the surface had hardened, cleared dead leaves from around the emerging stems, and returned small stones to the edges, where they prevented loose soil from spilling onto the bricks. The green timetable book stayed open upon the bench while she worked. Samuel's instructions were never written as instructions. There were no numbered tasks, and no complete account of how the garden ought to be cared for. Instead, Edith found brief observations scattered among years of railway entries. Do not water thrift unless ground remains dry 3 days. Bellflowers slow after cold east wind. Leave old stems until new leaves show clearly. Lavender dislikes wet roots near wall. The notes required patience. Edith sometimes read several pages before finding the line that applied to the bed in front of her. On other mornings, she found nothing and left the plants alone. Samuel's garden had survived many seasons without her understanding, and she did not suppose that every silence in the book needed to be filled by her hands. The bed beside the green bench remained the first place she visited each day. For more than a week, the soil showed no change. Rain softened the shallow lines left by the fork, and a dry afternoon later erased them altogether. The ground looked as empty as it had before she opened the cream packet. Edith continued to examine it without touching the surface. She knew that seeds did much of their work beyond sight. Samuel's book had taught her that the interval between sowing and emergence was not an empty period. It was part of the garden's time, though nothing upon the surface announced its passing. Elsewhere, the older plants became easier to distinguish. The sea thrift near the eastern end of the platform gathered itself into firmer grey-green cushions among the gravel. By the waiting room steps, the bellflower leaves widened and began to overlap. Pale campion rose in slender pairs against the station wall, while the lavender at the western end showed small new leaves beneath branches that had appeared dry enough to discard. Edith compared each change with Samuel's notes. Some appeared exactly where he had recorded them. Others had shifted slightly during the winter. Seeds had fallen beyond the edges of their beds, and roots had passed beneath the bricks. Edith did not force every plant back into its former boundary. She cleared enough space to keep the arrangement visible, but allowed the youngest shoots to remain where the earth had accepted them. The platform path required more deliberate work. Several bricks between the ticket office door and the green bench had sunk during the winter. Rainwater collected in the hollows, leaving mud at the edges and making the path uneven beneath Edith's boots. She had noticed the damage on her first afternoon at Bramblewick, but had left it while the station rooms demanded attention. Now that the interior had been returned to order, she carried Samuel's narrow spade and a stiff brush from the garden store. She began with one brick. Its surface was worn smooth, where generations of passengers had crossed towards the waiting room. Edith worked the soil loose around it, lifted it carefully, and placed it beside the path. Beneath lay a shallow hollow, where sand and earth had been washed away. She filled the space with dry gravel from beside the store, pressed it level with a block of wood, and returned the brick to its original position. It stood slightly higher than the others. Edith lifted it again, removed a little gravel, and tried once more. On the third attempt, the brick settled evenly beneath her palm. She repaired only 4 that morning. The work placed a strain across her shoulders, and the damp earth clung heavily to the spade. Yet when she walked back towards the station house, her steps no longer altered to avoid the deepest hollow. The following day, she repaired another section. She did not make the path look new. Many bricks had been chipped at the corners, and their colors varied from dark brown to faded red. Some carried narrow grooves made by luggage trolleys. Others had sunk so gradually that grass had rooted between them. Edith removed only what made the path unsafe or prevented rainwater from draining away. As the bricks returned to level, an older pattern became visible. They formed a narrow route beside the garden beds, widening near the waiting room door and again in front of the ticket window. The spaces had been shaped by the movements of people who no longer came, passengers gathering beneath the canopy, porters turning with handcarts, and children stepping aside when the afternoon train arrived. Repairing the path did not erase those movements. It made them easier to see. The green bench needed attention next. Its paint had faded almost to grey across the seat, while the back retained strips of the darker green Edith remembered from childhood. Rain had raised the grain of the wood. One end shifted slightly whenever anyone sat upon it, though the iron supports remained sound. Edith carried the bench away from the wall on a dry morning and placed it beneath the canopy. She tightened the loose fittings, brushed away the flaking paint, and smoothed the roughest places with sandpaper from Samuel's workbench. The task occupied most of the day. Fine green dust settled upon her sleeves and collected in the joints between the platform bricks. Beneath the most recent coat, she found traces of earlier colors. There was a darker railway green close to the wood, followed by a thinner layer that had weathered almost black. Samuel had painted the bench more than once without removing all that came before. Each coat had protected the same timber while leaving a small part of its history beneath the next. Edith chose the green that most closely matched the paint remaining upon the back. She worked from one end to the other with a narrow brush, laying the color in long, careful strokes. The fresh paint appeared too bright at first. Against the old station wall and dull platform stones, the bench looked newly arrived, as though it had been delivered for passengers expected later that afternoon. By evening, however, the light had softened it. Edith placed a small handwritten notice upon the seat so that no visitor would sit before the paint had dried. Then she left the ticket office door open and worked inside, while the smell of oil and fresh paint drifted gently through the brass window. For 2 days, she sat upon the waiting room step instead. From there, she could see the newly leveled path, the restored markers, and the bench standing empty beneath the canopy. The changes were modest. No one passing along the distant lane would have mistaken Bramblewick for an operating station. The rails remained unused, the timetable frame remained empty, and no porter waited beside the luggage room door. Yet the place no longer appeared to be retreating into neglect. It seemed held. During the 4th week, the weather grew milder. The morning mist began lifting before Edith finished breakfast. Sunlight remained upon the western wall later in the day, and the soil near the platform edge dried more quickly after rain. Edith adjusted her work according to the notes in Samuel's book. Beds that received long afternoon light were watered in the morning. Those beneath the ticket office window retained enough moisture to be left alone. She learned to carry water in smaller amounts. At first, she had filled the metal watering can almost to its rim, believing fewer journeys from the pump would make the work easier. Instead, the weight pulled against her wrist, and the water fell too heavily around the young stems. She began filling it halfway. The lighter can allowed her to direct a fine stream close to the earth, without flattening the leaves. Her movements became slower, and more certain. She no longer returned to the green book before tending every bed. She knew that the thrift preferred the dry gravel, and that water remained longest in the shade by the waiting room steps. She recognized the campion leaves from the wallflower and could distinguish the young lavender from the grey weeds that grew between its roots. The knowledge had entered her hands before she noticed possessing it. Inside the station, Samuel's belongings gradually settled into their proper groups. Edith filled several inventory pages, wrapped fragile household pieces, and emptied drawers that had remained closed since autumn. Yet the date of her departure no longer stood before every task as sharply as it had during her first week. When she arrived, 6 weeks had seemed sufficient because the work had appeared finite. A cupboard could be emptied, a chair could be listed, papers could be tied, rooms swept, and keys returned. Each completed task reduced what remained. The garden did not behave in the same manner. Every morning brought a change too small to be called an event. A leaf unfolded, a stem straightened after rain, a patch of earth dried sooner than the previous day. None of these things could be completed or crossed from an inventory. They asked only to be noticed and, when necessary, cared for. Edith began making small entries of her own in the green book. She did not write between Samuel's older records. At the end of his final season, she used the blank space beneath the line, recording the unsown bed. Thrift stronger at eastern edge. 2 campion shoots beside wall. Path repaired between office and bench. Green bench painted. Same color retained. Her handwriting remained broader than Samuel's and leaned slightly to the right. At first, each new line seemed to disturb the narrow order of his pages. After several days, the difference no longer troubled her. The book did not require her hand to resemble his. It required only that the garden be observed truthfully. One morning, near the end of April, Edith found the first signs of growth in the bed beside the bench. They were so small that she nearly mistook them for grains of moss. 3 pale green points had broken through the soil near the shelter of the bench leg. A 4th stood a short distance away, still bent beneath a fragment of earth. Edith knelt beside them. She did not touch the shoots or remove the soil resting upon the smallest one. By midday, it had lifted the fragment without assistance. The seeds marked with her name had begun to grow. She recorded their emergence in the timetable book, but told no one. There was nothing secret in the discovery. Mrs. Fenn would probably notice them on her next visit, and Mr. Alden might see them if he came again by the yard. Edith simply wished to let the first leaves exist without explanation. Over the following days, more appeared. They formed no perfect row. Some emerged close together, while others stood beyond the shallow lines Edith had originally drawn. Their stems were thin, and their first leaves too small to promise the white flowers described in Samuel's earlier records. Still, the bed was no longer empty. As April moved towards May, the differences between the garden beds became clearer. Samuel's arrangement, first visible through faded markers and entries in the green book, now began to show itself through the plants. The earliest group stood near the eastern edge of the platform, where the morning light reached first. Low sea thrift occupied the gravel beside the marker for the 7:20 passenger. Farther along, the leaves grew broader, around the place of the 10:45 market train. Taller stems appeared beside the midday and afternoon markers, while lavender and campion waited near the western end, where the last light rested against the wall. Edith had understood the sequence when she matched the numbers in Samuel's book with the wooden labels. Until now, however, it had remained an arrangement of names and hours. The living form of it was different. One late afternoon, she stood inside the ticket office with the brass window open. The sun had moved beyond the platform roof, leaving the nearest bricks in shade, while light continued to touch the far beds. From behind the ticket counter, Edith could see almost the entire length of the garden. The groups of leaves followed one another like entries upon a railway page. The first lay low against the gravel. The next rose near the waiting room steps. Other beds continued westward in measured intervals, each divided by a marker, a strip of brick, or a narrow space Samuel had deliberately left unplanted. The heights changed as the day's train times had once changed. Morning began close to the rails. Midday gathered beneath the windows, and evening ended beside the warm western wall. Samuel had not attempted to make the garden resemble a railway in any decorative sense. There were no flower beds shaped like engines, no stones arranged as wheels, and no signs explaining the design. A person who had never seen the Green Book might notice only several modest groups of plants along an abandoned platform. But from the ticket window, Edith could read them. The garden was the timetable written again in leaves. Each cluster occupied the place of an arrival. Each gap preserved the quiet interval in which the platform had once stood empty. The line began with the first passenger of the morning and ended where the final evening train had departed towards the western fields. Even the changing light belonged to the arrangement. It reached one bed and then another, moving along the platform with greater patience than any train. When clouds crossed the valley, the whole garden dimmed together. When the sun returned, the eastern leaves brightened first, and the light traveled towards the bench. Edith remained behind the brass window until the last strip of sun withdrew from the wall. She imagined Samuel standing in the same place after the station closed. For most of his life, he had looked through that opening to check the platform, watch for passengers, and wait for the signal beyond the bend. Later, when no trains remained, the same window had allowed him to observe the garden without leaving his desk. The timetable had not been a memorial built after the railway ended. Its beginnings reached back through the years when trains still stopped at Bramblewick. Samuel had allowed the two forms of time to grow beside one another until the railway day and the garden year occupied the same narrow ground. Edith closed the brass window but left the Green Book open upon the counter. The following morning, she resumed her work. She brushed loose soil from the repaired path. She removed 2 weeds from the campion bed and left a third plant untouched until she could identify it. She carried a half-filled watering can to the chutes beside the green bench and poured only enough to darken the earth around them. Then she sat upon the newly painted seat. The green had lost its first brightness and now belonged more naturally to the station. Beneath it, the young daisies stood in the shelter of the iron legs. Beyond them, the garden continued along the platform in the order Samuel had given it. Edith had come to Bramblewick intending to spend 6 weeks closing what remained of her brother's life. Instead, the weeks had passed while something beneath the windows quietly opened, not yet into flowers, only into leaves. But leaves were enough to show where the next season would begin. By the beginning of May, the 6 weeks Edith had allowed herself at Bramblewick were nearly over. She did not mark their end upon the calendar. The date stood clearly enough among the household papers, beside the notes she had made before leaving home, yet it no longer possessed the certainty it had carried in March. Then, 6 weeks had seemed a reasonable measure for the closing of rooms, the sorting of possessions, and the settlement of Samuel's affairs. Now the same period appeared to have measured something quite different. The time required for sea thrift to gather strength among the gravel, for campion stems to rise against the wall, and for the smallest daisy leaves to emerge beside the green bench. Most of Samuel's belongings had been examined. His clothes had been folded, the railway documents separated from his private papers, and the household objects entered carefully in Edith's inventory. Only a few cupboards remained untouched, and none contained enough to delay her departure for more than a day or two. The garden could not be arranged so neatly. Its beds continued beyond the limits of her lists. Some plants were only beginning to reveal themselves, while others remained beneath the soil. Several pages of the green timetable book referred to flowers that would not appear until June or July. Samuel's notes described their colors, their preferred places, and the years in which they had failed, returned, or spread beyond their markers. Edith could read what was expected. She could not remain long enough to see it. One morning, while she was brushing dry soil from the repaired platform path, she heard a horse approaching along the lane. The sound came slowly through the still air, accompanied by the light rattle of wheels. Edith rested the brush against the station wall and looked towards the yard gate. A small dark carriage appeared beyond the hedge, past the former parcel's entrance, and stopped beside the disused loading area. The man who descended wore a brown traveling coat and carried a leather document case beneath one arm. He was perhaps 50 years old, with iron-grey hair, narrow spectacles, and the reserved expression of someone accustomed to entering buildings that no longer belonged to the people living in them. After speaking briefly to the driver, he looked first at the station roof, then at the chimneys, and finally along the rails. He did not look at the garden until he had opened his case. Edith crossed the yard to meet him. The visitor introduced himself as Mr. Mercer, a surveyor acting for the railway company. A letter announcing his visit had been sent several days earlier, but it had gone first to the solicitor handling Samuel's estate and had reached Bramblewick only that morning. Edith had left it unopened upon the kitchen table while carrying water to the platform. Mr. Mercer apologized for the short notice, without appearing surprised by it. He removed a folded plan from his case and explained that the company had begun reviewing the land attached to stations closed during the previous year. Some buildings would be sold, others might be let to private tenants. Structures judged unsafe or unnecessary could eventually be removed, though no decision had yet been made concerning Bramblewick. The words were delivered in the same tone he might have used to describe the dimensions of a coal shed. Edith had known the station did not belong to Samuel. The house had been provided with his position, and the platform, waiting room, offices, store buildings and land beside the line remained railway property. Only the contents of the living rooms and a few tools were part of his estate. Still, until Mr. Mercer unfolded the plan, the distinction had felt less immediate. The sheet showed Bramblewick as a collection of measured spaces. The station master's house was outlined in black. The waiting room, ticket office, and luggage room formed a narrow block beside it. The platform appeared as a long rectangle, while the garden was represented by an unmarked strip between the buildings and the edge of the railway boundary. There were no beds upon the plan, no markers, no green bench. Mr. Mercer placed the paper upon the old parcels counter and weighted its corners with his measuring book, an ink bottle, and 2 small brass instruments. He asked Edith to show him each part of the property, beginning with the station house. They entered through the kitchen. Mr. Mercer examined the hearth, looked beneath the sink, and tapped several sections of the wall with the handle of his walking stick. He noted the condition of the floorboards, the number of rooms, and the position of the pump. Upstairs, he measured the windows and checked the ceilings for signs of damp. Edith followed with the keys. The room seemed changed by his inspection. The narrow bedroom overlooking the orchard became a set of dimensions. The parlor became a fireplace, 2 windows and a section of wall requiring repair. Samuel's room was reduced to its floor area and the condition of its plaster. Mr. Mercer was not unkind. He moved carefully among the remaining furniture and waited while Edith shifted Samuel's walking stick from behind a door he wished to examine. Yet nothing in the house invited him to imagine the life that had been lived there. His concern was whether rain entered beneath the roof tiles, whether the drains remained clear, and whether a future tenant might occupy the rooms without significant expense to the company. In the waiting room, he tested the door, inspected the wooden benches, and looked through the brass ticket window. Edith opened the office for him and moved Samuel's green book and seed tin away from the section of counter where he placed his case. "The fittings remain company property," he said, glancing at the ticket racks and the empty frame where the public timetable had once hung. Edith nodded. Mr. Mercer entered each item in his notebook. He recorded the benches, counter, wall clock, stove, coat pegs, and luggage scales. When he came to the stopped clock, he looked up at its hands. 4:17, he observed. "Does it still run?" "It has not run since the station closed." He wrote something beside the word clock, but did not ask why it had stopped at that particular time. They continued outside. Mr. Mercer measured the width of the platform and examined the masonry at its edge. He walked beside the rails without stepping onto them, stopping at intervals to study the sleepers and the weeds growing between them. Though no regular train now used the branch, the line had not yet been formally abandoned. The company therefore intended to retain the rails, the signalling ground, and a narrow access route through the property. The remaining land might be divided. Mr. Mercer pointed to the plan. The station master's house could be let separately from the waiting room. The former luggage room and goods yard might be offered to a local merchant. The garden strip beside the platform was too narrow for farming, but it could perhaps be included with whichever part of the property found a tenant. Edith looked along the beds. The morning light had reached the sea thrift. Farther west, the bellflower leaves remained in shade beneath the edge of the canopy. The markers divided the plants according to Samuel's timetable, though from the yard They appeared no more than short pieces of weathered wood. Mr. Mercer stepped from the brick path to examine the lower section of the station wall. "Mind the bed," Edith said. The words came more quickly than she intended. He stopped before placing his boot among the young campion and moved back onto the bricks. For the first time, he looked closely at the ground. "I had taken these for weeds. They form a garden." "Yes," he said after a moment. "I see that now." Edith brought the green timetable book from the ticket office. She did not explain every entry or show him the seed packets. She opened only the pages that placed the beds in their order along the platform. Mr. Mercer examined the notes through his narrow spectacles. His expression did not change, though he remained with the book longer than Edith expected. He looked from the 7:20 entry to the eastern bed, then along the markers towards the western wall. The plants were not yet high enough to make the design obvious from where they stood, but the correspondence between the numbers and their positions could be understood. "Your brother maintained this after the closure. He began it while trains still stopped here. He continued after the last service." Mr. Mercer closed the book carefully. The existence of a garden did not alter the ownership of the land. He explained this without severity, as though wishing to prevent Edith from mistaking his interest for authority. Any future use would require approval from the district office. The company might prefer to sell the buildings together. It might reserve the entire platform in case railway use resumed. A prospective tenant could submit a written request, but Mr. Mercer could promise nothing. Until that moment, Edith had not considered herself a prospective tenant. She had thought only of the garden after she left. Perhaps Mrs. Fenn might occasionally remove weeds. Mr. Alden might straighten a fallen marker if he passed through the yard. Someone could be asked to water the youngest plants during a dry week. Yet none of them possessed the keys, and none had offered to take responsibility for the station. If the house and waiting room were let to a stranger, the beds might be cleared before their purpose was understood. The wooden markers could be mistaken for rubbish. The green bench might be moved, and the garden strip could become a place for storing timber, coal, or empty carts. Edith had tried not to imagine these possibilities because they belonged to decisions she believed would be made after her departure. Now Mr. Mercer's plan placed them directly before her. They returned to the waiting room, where the sunlight from the platform fell in pale rectangles across the floor. Mr. Mercer opened his notebook and began adding figures from the measurements he had taken. Edith stood beside the brass ticket window. From there, she could see the garden as Samuel had seen it. The low eastern plants marked the morning passenger. The beds continued past the waiting room steps, beneath the office window, and towards the green bench. Beyond the bench, the later hours waited in taller leaves against the western wall. The young daisies remained almost invisible from inside. Edith knew where to look for them, but they were still too small to be distinguished from the soil at that distance. She thought of the cream packet in the seed tin. Samuel had kept her name through more than 30 summers without knowing whether she would return to Bramblewick. He had not preserved the original seeds untouched. He had trusted them to the earth, gathered what followed, and begun again. The preservation lay in continuing the garden, not in closing it safely inside a box. "Mr. Mercer," Edith said, "may the request be made before the property is offered elsewhere." He stopped writing. She asked whether the station master's house might be let together with the waiting room and the strip of land beside the platform. The luggage room, goods yard, and rails were not necessary, nor did she require the signal ground. She wished only for the house, the public room, and enough of the platform to preserve access to the beds. Mr. Mercer looked towards the garden. "For yourself, Miss Marlowe?" "Yes." The answer surprised her less than the question. He reminded her that no passenger service would return merely because the waiting room remained. The building would be let as an ordinary dwelling, and the company would not undertake to restore the clock, maintain the garden, or preserve railway fittings beyond those named in the agreement. Edith understood. He asked how long she wished to remain. She had no answer prepared. 6 weeks had once seemed definite. A year now seemed both too long to promise and too short for the garden described in Samuel's book. She told him she would accept the ordinary term offered by the company, provided the use of the waiting room and garden strip was written clearly into the lease. Mr. Mercer considered the plan once more. The request was unusual, but not impossible. The house had no convenient road access, separate from the station yard, which made division less practical. The waiting room possessed little value on its own, and the strip beside the platform was too narrow to interest most buyers. Letting the three together might therefore be considered, though the district office would decide the terms. He took a clean sheet from his case. Edith watched while he wrote her name, her present address, and the parts of Bramblewick she wished to rent. His language transformed the place once again. Dwelling formerly occupied by station master, former passenger waiting room with adjoining office, garden ground bordering disused platform, excluding operational railway boundary. There was no space in the description for the sea thrift, Samuel's timetable, or the daisies beside the bench. Edith did not ask him to add them. If the ground itself were included, the plants could remain without being named individually. Mr. Mercer read the request aloud, then passed the paper to her. Edith signed at the bottom. Her handwriting looked firm, though she had made the decision only moments before. It was the same hand that now appeared beneath Samuel's entries in the Green Book, wider than his and leaning slightly towards the right. Mr. Mercer sanded the ink, folded the sheet, and placed it inside his leather case. He could give no indication of how the district office would respond. The company might take several weeks to consider the matter. Another offer could already have been made. Repairs to the roof and drains would be taken into account, and a rent would have to be calculated after his report was examined. Edith asked whether she might remain until an answer arrived. He could not formally grant permission, but neither had he been instructed to require her immediate departure. As Samuel's executor and closest relative, she could continue settling the contents of the house for a reasonable period. Mr. Mercer advised her to keep the solicitor informed. It was not an assurance. It was enough for the present. The survey continued for another hour. Mr. Mercer inspected the garden store, coal shed, and former luggage room. He marked 2 cracks in the outer wall, tested the rain gutter near the kitchen, and measured the boundary between the platform beds and the rails. Edith accompanied him without speaking much. At the western end, he paused beside the lavender. The plants were still low, their grey leaves only beginning to cover the older wood. Samuel's marker for the final passenger stood close to the wall. Mr. Mercer read the faded numbers. 6:05, he said. The last train of the day. He looked towards the bend beyond the fields. Nothing moved along the line. The rails held a narrow brightness beneath the afternoon sun, but grass had begun to grow around the nearest sleepers. Mr. Mercer returned his measuring tape to its case. Before leaving, he gave Edith the address of the district office and the reference number under which Bramblewick would be considered. She copied both into her inventory book. He advised her not to make expensive repairs until the company reached its decision. Edith assured him that she had no such intention. The bench had been painted with supplies already in Samuel's store. The path had been repaired with gravel from the yard. The garden required time more often than money. Mr. Mercer placed his hat upon his head and crossed towards the waiting carriage. At the gate, he turned once to look back at the station. From that distance, the fresh green of the bench was the clearest sign of change. The flowers had not yet opened, and the low beds blended with the earth. Then he entered the carriage, and the wheels carried him away along the lane. Edith remained beside the yard until the sound disappeared. The station seemed quieter after an official visitor had measured it. Every wall, doorway, and length of ground now possessed a figure in Mr. Mercer's notebook. Somewhere beyond Bramblewick, those figures would be considered by people who had never stood behind the ticket window or watched light pass from one garden bed to the next. She returned to the waiting room. The plan was gone from the parcels counter, leaving 4 small marks in the dust where its corners had been held flat. Edith wiped them away with her cloth. She replaced Samuel's green book and the seed tin upon the upper shelf, then opened the brass window. Nothing outside had changed. The sea thrift remained beside the gravel. The bellflower leaves still gathered beneath the steps. The young daisies stood near the iron leg of the bench, too small to promise whether they would survive. Yet the station no longer felt entirely suspended between Samuel's death and Edith's departure. A request now travelled through the railway offices. It might be accepted or refused. Until a letter returned, Bramblewick belonged to neither future. Edith found the uncertainty less difficult than she expected. The garden had already taught her that waiting did not mean nothing was happening. Beneath bare soil, seeds opened without sound. Roots continued into places no one could see. A bed that appeared unchanged in the morning might contain the beginning of leaves not yet strong enough to reach the light. She closed the office for the evening and carried the keys into the house. That night, rain passed over the valley. It began lightly against the bedroom window, strengthened for a short while after midnight, and ended before dawn. Edith woke once to the sound moving along the roof and into the gutters. Farther away, the wind travelled between the rails, producing the same low note she had mistaken for a train on her first night at Bramblewick. This time, she did not rise to look from the window. She knew no train was coming. In the morning, water remained upon the platform bricks and along the rims of Samuel's wooden markers. The beds nearest the wall were damp, but beneath the canopy, the earth beside the green bench had received very little rain. Edith lit the kitchen fire and made tea. Mr. Mercer's reference number lay upon the table beside her inventory. She read it once, then closed the book. There could be no answer that morning. The request had scarcely begun its journey. After breakfast, she filled the watering can halfway. She carried it through the waiting room, past the stopped clock, and onto the platform. The air smelled of wet stone and young leaves. Near the bench, the smallest daisies stood upright in the dark earth. Edith poured a thin stream around them. Then she moved to the next bed. No letter had arrived. No promise had been made. But the garden still required water. For several days after Mr. Mercer's visit, no letter came from the railway company. Each morning, Edith heard the postman's bicycle or footsteps upon the lane and looked up from whatever task occupied her. Sometimes he brought a newspaper for the farm beyond the fields or a folded bill for Mrs. Fenn. More often, he passed the station without entering the yard. Edith had not expected an immediate decision. Mr. Mercer had warned her that the request must travel through several offices before anyone could approve it. Even so, the sound of the postman departing left the house a little quieter. The garden gave her other changes to observe. Near the eastern end of the platform, slender stems had risen above the grey-green leaves of the sea thrift. Each carried a closed head no larger than a small button. Samuel's green book placed their usual flowering during the second week of May, though the exact day altered with the wind and rain. Edith examined them every morning without touching them. After 3 clear days, she stepped from the ticket office and noticed a small patch of pink among the gravel. The first thrift flower had opened. It was modest enough to be overlooked from the waiting room door. Only when Edith knelt beside it could she see the many tiny petals gathered into a rounded head. The color reminded her of the faded railway tickets she had found beneath Samuel's counter, though it was lighter at the edges and moved gently whenever the air passed along the line. She brought out the green book and opened it beneath the morning light. First thrift opened. 3 clear days. Air still. The entry required only 1 line. By the following afternoon, 4 more heads had opened around the first. Their color made the eastern bed visible from the yard and drew the eye towards the place where the earliest passenger train had once arrived. Mrs. Fenn noticed them when she came to return a preserving jar. She placed the jar in the kitchen and walked directly onto the platform. For a moment, she stood with her hands folded beneath her apron, looking at the flowers rather than at Edith. She remembered Samuel planting thrift there while trains still stopped at Bramblewick. A young woman, returning from the coast, had brought him the first seeds. Mrs. Fenn could not recall the woman's name, and the original plants might not have survived, but Samuel had continued gathering and sowing their seeds in the same bed. The flowers had returned to their proper place. "They make the station look as though someone is expected," Mrs. Fenn said. After she left, Edith stood near the yard gate and looked back at the platform. The repaired path and painted bench had restored some order to Bramblewick, but the first color altered it more deeply. The flowers did not make the station appear open again. There were no passengers, no porter, and no smoke beyond the trees. Yet the platform no longer seemed to be waiting only for its own disappearance. During the next few days, more thrift opened beside the 7:20 marker. The first visitor who came especially to see it was Mr. Alden. He arrived shortly after 7, carrying his cap in one hand. The hour was close to that of the morning train he had once helped Samuel receive. Mr. Alden stood beside the flowers and looked eastward along the rails. He remembered the ordinary passengers most clearly: farm workers carrying baskets, children traveling to school, and a clerk who boarded every weekday while fastening one glove. In wet weather, they had gathered beneath the canopy. On clear mornings, they moved towards the platform edge as soon as smoke appeared beyond the bend. Most of their names had faded from his memory, but their habits remained. The thrift grew where those journeys had begun. Later that week, a woman returning from the village saw the flowers through the open gate and entered with an empty market basket. Edith recognized her from Samuel's funeral, though she did not know her well. Many years earlier, the woman had taken the morning train from Bramblewick to begin work in a household near York. Her mother had waited beside her until the train arrived. She remembered the weight of her small case, the bread wrapped inside it, and the rain moving across the carriage window. Several years later, the same railway had brought her home. The woman did not remain long. Before leaving, she touched the handle of her empty basket and looked once more towards the eastern bend. After that, a few more people began pausing at the station. They did not arrive together, and Edith gave no invitation. The open yard gate and the flowers were enough. Some stood beside the thrift for only a minute before continuing towards the fields. Others sat upon the green bench and recalled a journey, a parcel collected from the luggage room, or an afternoon spent waiting for a delayed train. Their memories were small and incomplete. One man remembered meeting a shipment of young fruit trees. An elderly woman recalled bringing her first child home during a winter snowfall. Another remembered missing the market train and waiting beneath the station clock with a basket of eggs beneath her coat. None of these journeys would have appeared in a railway history, yet each had left something at Bramblewick: a place beside the ticket window, the sound of a case crossing the bricks, or a final wave through carriage glass. The flowers gave those memories somewhere to return. Edith continued her work while visitors came and went. She opened the waiting room door each morning, swept the path, and watered only the beds that required it. People kept to the bricks and did not pick the flowers. Once, after an elderly couple had departed, Edith found that one of Samuel's leaning markers had been carefully straightened. The next color appeared near the waiting room steps. A single bellflower opened in the shade, its blue cup turned towards the wall. Two more followed the next morning. When sunlight reached them, their petals became almost transparent. From inside the ticket office, Edith looked through the open brass window. The pink thrift marked the first arrival. The blue bellflowers stood beside the next. Between them lay an interval of green leaves and empty bricks, preserving the quiet space that had once separated two trains. Farther west, the campion and wallflowers still held their buds closed. The lavender near the final marker would not flower until later in the summer. Samuel's timetable was returning gradually, one bed after another. The garden did not obey the hours written upon the wooden labels. It followed weather, soil, and season. Yet its colors appeared in nearly the same order as the trains had once crossed Bramblewick. Morning began in pink beside the gravel. Blue gathered near the steps. The later hours remained green. Edith recorded the first bellflowers in Samuel's book. Beneath the entry, she added a short note about the woman who had remembered waiting beside them as a child. Her handwriting remained broader than Samuel's, but it no longer seemed out of place upon the page. A few days later, pale campion opened against the station wall. The wallflowers followed, carrying muted yellow and brown within their petals. When warmed by the afternoon sun, their scent traveled beneath the canopy and into the ticket office. The smell mixed with the old traces of timber, dust, and coal smoke that remained in the waiting room. Samuel had not planted his garden apart from the railway. He had allowed it to grow among arriving trains, moving luggage, and waiting passengers. Steam must once have crossed the flowers, coats must have brushed the lavender, and boots must occasionally have disturbed the edges of the beds. Now the railway day returned without noise. It appeared in leaves, colour, and scent. Still, no letter came. Edith's 6 weeks had passed, though she had stopped counting them precisely. Samuel's possessions had been sorted, and there was little household business left to complete. If the railway company refused her request, she could prepare to leave within a few days. Until then, she remained. The uncertainty was clearest each morning before the post arrived. Afterwards, there was always work to occupy her hands. A weed appeared among the campion. Dry earth gathered beneath the canopy. New stems leaned towards the light and required space. Near the green bench, the daisies grown from the packet bearing Edith's name continued to strengthen. Their leaves had widened, though there was still no sign of white among them. The railway letter arrived on a mild morning near the middle of May. Edith saw the postman enter the yard while she was drying a cup beside the kitchen sink. He carried a cream envelope marked with the district office seal and Mr. Mercer's reference number. She accepted it at the door and placed it beside the teapot. For several moments, she remained standing. Through the kitchen doorway, she could see the lower part of the waiting room clock. Its hands still rested at 17 minutes past 4. Beyond the outer door, sunlight lay across the first section of the platform. Whatever the letter contained, the flowers would remain where they had opened. Edith broke the seal. The first page described the portions of Bramblewick that the railway company intended to retain. The rails, signalling ground, luggage room, and access to the line would remain under company control. She continued reading. The company was prepared to let Edith the former station master's house, together with the waiting room, adjoining ticket office, and the garden strip beside the disused platform. The tenancy would begin at the start of June and continue for 12 months. Renewal would depend upon the company's future requirements. The rent was written near the bottom of the page. It was smaller than Edith had feared. The waiting room and garden held little commercial value, and the house required repairs the company did not intend to undertake immediately. The amount was within what she could manage. Nothing in the letter mentioned Samuel's timetable, the green bench, or the flowers. The garden appeared only as a strip of ground. That was enough. The second sheet contained the conditions and a place for Edith's signature. She carried both pages into the ticket office and laid them upon Samuel's counter. Through the open brass window, the beds extended along the platform. Thrift marked the eastern end. Bellflowers stood near the steps. Pale campion and warm wallflowers occupied the middle hours, while the later beds waited for their season. Edith read the agreement once more. 12 months did not make Bramblewick hers. The company could refuse renewal, and the railway itself remained beyond her control. Yet a year would allow her to see the daisies open, gather their seeds, and prepare the beds for another spring. She signed her name. Her hand leaned slightly towards the right, just as it did beneath Samuel's entries in the Green Book. After the ink had dried, Edith folded the company's copy for the afternoon post. She did not go immediately to Mrs. Fenn or seek Mr. Alden. There would be time to tell them when they next came through the gate. Instead, she returned to the platform. She removed a weed beside the bellflowers, brushed loose earth from the path, and checked the dry bed beneath the canopy. Then she walked to the green bench. At the center of the strongest daisy plant, a small rounded bud had risen above the leaves. It was no larger than the head of a pin and remained entirely green. A second plant carried the beginning of another. Edith knelt beside them. The seeds Samuel had marked with her name had passed through more than 30 summers. He had sown them, gathered from them, and returned them to the earth without knowing whether Edith would ever come back to Bramblewick. Now they were preparing to flower beneath her care. She brought the Green Book from the ticket office and opened it to the final page. Railway Company agreed to tenancy of house, waiting room, and garden. First buds on Edith daisies beside green bench. The two entries occupied neighboring lines. One belonged to offices, measured boundaries and cream paper. The other belonged to weather, soil, and a packet tied with blue thread. Together, they gave Bramblewick another season. Edith closed the book and sat upon the bench. Along the platform, the first flowers moved softly in the morning air. Villagers would come to see them. Some would remember journeys. Others might notice only the color. Beside Edith, the daisies had not yet opened, but their buds had already turned towards the light. At the beginning of June, Edith's tenancy of Bramblewick formally began. Nothing at the station looked different that morning. No notice appeared at the yard gate, and the railway company sent no one to mark the change. The rails, luggage room, and signalling ground remained beyond the boundary described in the agreement. The house, waiting room, ticket office, and garden strip were now hers to care for during the coming year. Edith placed the signed lease in the lowest drawer of Samuel's desk. Then she opened the waiting room door. The room was already clean, but it still carried the stillness of a place preserved rather than used. The wooden benches stood against the walls. The coat pegs were empty. The luggage scales remained near the doorway, and the clock above them continued to show 17 minutes past 4. Edith did not wish to make the room resemble an ordinary parlor. Its plainness belonged to Bramblewick. She polished the benches, wiped the brass ticket window, and cleared the ashes from the small stove. On the sill, she placed a jar containing 3 wallflowers that had bent after rain. That was enough. During the first week of June, several villagers entered the waiting room after walking along the platform. Some remained standing, as though uncertain whether the benches could still be used. Others sat without asking. The room offered shade in the afternoon and shelter when a brief shower crossed the valley. One morning, Mrs. Fenn arrived while rain was falling heavily against the canopy. She had intended to stay only long enough to see the daisies beside the green bench, but the sudden weather drove her indoors. She sat upon the bench nearest the stove and placed her basket beside her feet. For several minutes, neither woman spoke. Rainwater traveled down the windows, blurring the flower beds beyond the glass. The room sounded different, with someone waiting inside it. A sleeve brushed the wooden bench. The basket handle creaked when Mrs. Fenn moved her hand. Her boots left 2 dark marks upon the floorboards. Long ago, such sounds would have passed unnoticed beneath conversation, luggage, and the approach of trains. Now each one could be heard clearly. When the rain weakened, Mrs. Fenn did not leave immediately. She looked towards the stopped clock and remembered waiting beneath it for her husband when he returned from market during the first year of their marriage. The train had been late, though she no longer knew by how many minutes. Samuel had added coal to the stove and told her she might remain until the lamps were extinguished. Mrs. Fenn had forgotten the delay. She remembered only the warmth of the room and the sound of rain upon the canopy. When she finally continued home, Edith noticed that the waiting room no longer appeared quite so unused. The dark marks from Mrs. Fenn's boots dried slowly near the bench. A few drops of water remained beneath the place where her basket had stood. Edith did not wipe them away until evening. Other people began using the room in the same quiet manner. A farm laborer rested there while carrying a repaired tool back from the village. 2 women placed their market baskets upon the luggage scales and sat beside the open door. Mr. Alden sometimes entered after walking the length of the platform, though he preferred to stand near the brass window where he had once spoken with Samuel. No one came to catch a train. They came because the gate was open, because flowers could be seen from the lane, and because the old waiting room offered a bench beneath a sound roof. Edith made no rules beyond those the room seemed to suggest. Muddy boots were brushed at the threshold. Nothing was taken from the garden. The ticket office remained her private place of work, but she kept the brass window open whenever she was there. Through it, she heard fragments of remembered journeys, a visit to a married daughter, a market day begun before sunrise, a soldier returning in winter, a parcel that had arrived without the expected label. The stories were seldom complete. People spoke until a particular image had been recovered, then allowed the conversation to move elsewhere. Often, the detail that remained was not the purpose of the journey, but something smaller: the smell of a wet coat, the weight of a sleeping child, or the sound of Samuel closing a carriage door. Edith began to understand that the station had held these memories without possessing any record of them. Samuel's green book preserved the garden. It contained sowing dates, weather, train times, and the names written upon seed packets, but the travelers themselves remained mostly beyond its pages. Their memories lived only as long as someone continued to tell them. One afternoon, Edith went into the village and returned with a plain-ruled notebook. Its cover was dark blue, without lettering or decoration. She carried it into the ticket office and placed it beside Samuel's green book. For several days, it remained there, unopened. Edith did not wish to turn the visitor's recollections into a formal history. Bramblewick had never been important enough to require one, and many people might prefer to speak without writing anything down. Still, she thought there should be a place for whatever they wished to leave behind. On a clear morning, she opened the new notebook to its first page. At the top, she wrote, "Bramblewick Waiting Room, Below it, after some consideration, she added, "For journeys remembered here." She placed the notebook upon the shelf beneath the brass ticket window, with a pencil beside it. There was no announcement. The first person to notice it was Mr. Alden. He picked it up, read Edith's words, and turned the blank pages between his fingers. Then he returned it to the shelf without writing. Edith continued sorting seed packets in the office. Mr. Alden walked outside, inspected the thrift and bellflowers, and sat upon the green bench. Nearly half an hour passed before he returned to the waiting room. This time, he opened the notebook. His hand moved slowly across the first line. When he finished, he closed the cover and placed the pencil exactly where he had found it. After he left, Edith waited before reading the entry. Mr. Alden had written, "Worked at Bramblewick for 28 years. Came back today to see the flowers. Nothing more was needed." Mrs. Fenn added the second entry 2 days later. She did not mention the delayed train or the evening Samuel had kept the stove burning for her. She wrote only that she had waited at Bramblewick many times and had always found the room warm in winter. Others followed. Some gave their full names, some wrote only initials. One person recorded the year of a first journey from Bramblewick. Another mentioned returning after 7 years away. A woman who could not write asked her companion to enter a sentence about bringing her infant son home through falling snow. Several visitors wrote nothing at all. The notebook remained available to them without becoming a requirement. Edith did not correct spelling or add dates where none had been given. She did not ask questions about unfamiliar names. Each entry belonged to the person who had left it and could remain as brief as memory chose to be. The room slowly gathered signs of use. The benches required dusting more often. A few dried leaves appeared near the doorway after windy afternoons. The wallflowers in the jar faded and were replaced with bellflowers from a stem broken close to the path. Yet the waiting room did not lose its quietness. People still lowered their voices upon entering. They looked towards the clock even though its hands never moved. Some sat for only a few minutes before continuing along the lane. Others remained until the light shifted across the floor. The room had begun serving its old purpose in a different way. It gave people somewhere to pause between one place and another. By the middle of June, the daisies beside the green bench were close to opening. Their buds had risen above the leaves on narrow stems. The green coverings began separating at their tips, revealing the smallest edges of white beneath them. Edith examined the plants each morning before opening the waiting room. Samuel's green book suggested that the flowers usually opened after several warm days. The weather remained mild. Sunlight reached the bench before noon and stayed upon the bed until late afternoon. Edith watered the soil carefully beneath the canopy, keeping the stream away from the buds. One morning, she found the first flower open. Its white petals were uneven, with one shorter than the others. The yellow center was small and bright. Beside it, 2 more buds had begun to loosen. Edith sat upon the green bench. The flower bearing her name was not rare. Similar daisies grew beside cottage walls, in meadow grass, and along the edges of fields. A traveler might have passed it without looking down, yet Samuel had gathered its seeds year after year. He had kept the packet tied with blue thread, not by preventing the flowers from changing, but by allowing each generation to grow and give way to the next. The daisies beside Edith were not the flowers of her childhood, they were their continuation. Mr. Alden arrived before noon and noticed the white petals immediately. He stood beside the bed for a moment, then went into the waiting room. Edith heard the notebook open beneath the brass window. After he had gone, she found a new line beneath the earlier entries. First of Miss Marlowe's daisies opened beside the bench. Edith read the sentence twice. Samuel's book contained the longer history of the seeds. The new notebook held only what had been witnessed that morning. Neither record replaced the other. One looked back through the garden. The other began from the people returning to it. Edith carried Samuel's green book onto the platform and recorded the flowering date. She noted the warm weather, the uneven petals and the 2 buds likely to open next. Then she returned both books to their places. The green volume remained inside the ticket office, protected among Samuel's papers. The blue notebook stayed beneath the open window where any visitor could reach it. In the days that followed, more daisies opened around the bench. Some faced the rails, others leaned towards the platform wall. Their white petals made the western bed visible from the waiting room doorway, filling one more place in Samuel's timetable. The station clock remained stopped. No signal changed. No train came around the eastern bend. Still, people entered through the yard gate. They walked beside the flowers, rested upon the benches, and sometimes left a few words in the blue book before continuing on their way. Bramblewick was no longer waiting for the railway to return. It had found another reason to keep its door open. By the 3rd week of June, the garden at Bramblewick had begun to show the shape Samuel had once given it. It was not complete. The lavender beside the final marker remained green, and the heather had produced only a few tender shoots. Some beds were filled with color, while others still seemed to be waiting. The garden followed no printed timetable now. Rain delayed one plant, sunlight hurried another, and each flower opened when its own season permitted. The sea thrift still formed a faded pink border near the eastern end of the platform. Blue bellflowers leaned beside the waiting room steps, and pale campion moved against the wall whenever wind traveled along the rails. The first poppies had appeared beyond the ticket office, their thin red petals opening in the morning and folding again before evening. Beside the green bench, Edith's daisies had multiplied. The first uneven flower was now surrounded by smaller white heads. Some faced the platform, others turned towards the disused line. Their stems were slender, yet they remained upright after rain. Each morning, Edith opened Samuel's green book and recorded what had changed. First poppy opened after warm night. 3 more daisies beside bench, lavender growing strongly. No flowers yet. Samuel's handwriting still filled most of the pages. His early entries were firm and dark, while those from his final years had become smaller and less even. Edith's broader hand followed them towards the bottom of the last page. She no longer felt that she was writing inside something that belonged only to him. The book had begun with Samuel, but the garden had never remained exactly as he first planted it. Seeds had been carried away and returned. Plants had disappeared from one bed and risen again in another. Even the daisies marked Edith. Summer 1862 were later generations of the flowers that had grown during her childhood. Continuation did not require everything to remain unchanged. It required only that something be carried forward. The waiting room had also settled into its new purpose. A jug of water stood upon the table. The wooden benches remained against the walls, and the coat rack still waited near the door. The clock above the luggage scales continued to show 17 minutes past 4. Visitors entered quietly. Some rested after walking from the village. Others came to see which flowers had opened. A few wrote in the blue notebook beneath the ticket window, leaving brief records of journeys once begun or ended at Bramblewick. A woman remembered traveling to market with her mother. A man recorded the morning he had left to begin an apprenticeship. Someone wrote only, "Returned after many years. The bench is still here." The notebook did not fill quickly. Several days sometimes passed without a new sentence. Edith never asked anyone to write. The blank pages were as much a part of the book as the words, leaving room for memories that had not yet returned. Mr. Alden came one warm afternoon and sat beneath the canopy. Mrs. Fenn arrived soon afterwards with a loaf wrapped in cloth. They remained in the waiting room while a brief summer rain darkened the platform. When the shower ended, sunlight returned before the rain had entirely stopped. Drops clung to the flower stems, and the rails shone through the long grass. Mr. Alden walked to the eastern end of the platform. For a moment, he stood where he had once waited for the morning train. Then he looked back towards the station house, the open waiting room door, and the flower beds stretching between the old markers. He said that Samuel would have recognized the garden. Edith looked along the platform. She thought Samuel would have recognized some of it. He would have known the thrift and bellflowers, the green bench and the daisies descended from his carefully saved seed. Yet other things had changed. The waiting room held a book he had never seen. Visitors now came without tickets, and Edith's handwriting continued where his had ended. Perhaps recognition did not depend upon finding everything as it had been. Perhaps it was enough to find that the place was still being cared for. After Mr. Alden and Mrs. Fenn had gone, Edith returned to the ticket office. Samuel's green book lay open upon the counter. Only a narrow space remained beneath her final entry. She wrote the date and added one last note. First summer after the final train. Garden flowering. Lavender and heather still to come. She waited for the ink to dry. Then she closed the book and placed it in the desk drawer with the seed packets Samuel had preserved. It would remain there as a record of the garden he had begun and the many seasons through which he had carried it. From the shelf, Edith took another unused notebook. It was plain, with a dark green cover and strong cream pages. She placed it upon the counter and opened to the first page. For a little while, she listened to the sound of water falling from the canopy onto the bricks. Then she wrote, Bramblewick Station Garden. Beneath the title, she entered the date. She did not write Samuel's name or her own. Both belonged to the garden already. Samuel's work remained in the beds, the labelled packets, and the flowers returning from year to year. Edith's part had begun when she reopened the waiting room door and pressed the first seeds into the earth. Others might continue it later. There was room in the new book for them. Edith left it open while she carried the watering can onto the platform. The rain had reached most of the beds, but the earth beneath the canopy remained dry. She poured water slowly around the daisies, watching it disappear into the dark soil. A bee moved among the open flowers. It settled briefly upon one yellow center, rose into the warm air, and crossed towards the campion. Another traveled between the poppies near the ticket office wall. Their low sound followed Edith as she returned the watering can to the kitchen. She did not close the waiting room that afternoon. The air was mild, and the lane beyond the yard remained quiet. A breeze passed through the open doorway, lifting one corner of the blue visitor's book before moving towards the ticket office. Edith sat upon the green bench. From there, she could see nearly the whole garden. The earliest beds were already beginning to fade. The middle ones held their full color. At the western end, the lavender and heather continued growing towards a season that had not yet arrived. Beyond them lay the railway line. Grass had risen between the sleepers, and small weeds grew along the ballast. No smoke appeared beyond the trees. No signal moved, and no vibration passed through the rails. The last train had gone many months before, yet Bramblewick had not become empty. The waiting room sheltered those who needed to pause. The two books preserved what people chose to remember. Flowers opened beside the old timetable markers, and seeds would be gathered when summer ended. Edith listened to the bees among the daisies and the wind moving over the disused line. Nothing hurried. Nothing was expected to arrive. The station no longer waited for a train. It waited only for spring, and spring always came.